Part 1 of Rethinking the Industrial Revolution, 5 Centuries of Transition from Agrarian to Industrial Capitalism in England, by Michael Andrew Žmolek. It's called England Transformed, Manufacturing and Agrarian Capitalism, 1348 to 1783. Chapter 1. The Prehistory of Industry. Quote, an initial question, how can one talk about, quote, industry, end quote, in a society often called, quote, pre-industrialized, end quote, or even, quote, pre-industrial, end quote. Is this not an obvious absurdity, end quote. D.C. Coleman. As the title of this chapter suggests, we are interested here in exploring the status of manufacturing prior to the Industrial Revolution. The term, quote, prehistory, end quote, is used to convey the need to understand the continuity between pre-industrial manufacturing and industrial manufacturing without losing the distinction. As Coleman writes, quote, the concept of an industrialized society brought into being by a process of industrialization, or more dramatically by what has come to be called an industrial revolution, must carry with it the corollary of a non-industrialized or pre-industrialized society. The definitions and distinctions are not precise, they do not have universal applicability, they are chronologically blunt. As useful labels, however, they convey meanings which other sorts of labels fail to convey, end quote. D.C. Coleman. Coleman has been perhaps the principal critic of the use of the term, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote, and has thus held up the greater part of one side in what could be called the, quote, proto-industrialization debate, end quote. In this chapter, we shall explore the evolution of manufacturing in England to the middle of the 17th century. In the process, critiques of both the theory of proto-industrialization and J.U. Neff's concept of an, quote, early industrial revolution, end quote, will be offered. Before we begin that exploration, however, it is necessary to say more about the concerns to be addressed in this chapter, including how those concerns differ from Coleman's concerns. The theory of agrarian capitalism, as articulated by Robert Brenner, Ellen Makeson's Wood, George Comnenel, and others, contends that changes in English agrarian class relations were key to the development of capitalism in England, as the foundation was laid for a revolution in manufacturing that essentially played out principles already well established in English agriculture. These principles include the divorcing of the direct producers from the means of production, rendering the direct producers market dependent, the control over production and therefore over the labor process by capital, and the subjection of production to market pressures that compel the owner to make efforts to systematically improve productivity. In Chapter 4, we will examine the operations of agrarian capitalism in greater detail. Here we shall explore the historical dynamic of the, quote, crafts, end quote, particularly in the 1500s and 1600s. According to the theory of agrarian capitalism, the critical developments of market imperatives and the growing market dependence of the agents of production were first realized in English agrarian relations. Given this, it remains to ask what role changes in pre-industrial manufacturing played in the transition. Given this, it remains to ask what role changes in pre-industrial manufacturing played in the transition. What changes can be understood as capitalist in nature? Were such changes merely necessary, or were those changes sufficient? At a broad level, the argument here will be that such changes were necessary but not sufficient in and of themselves without the critical transformation of agrarian class relations in England. This is not to deny the importance of changes in English manufacturing prior to the Industrial Revolution, nor is the argument simply one of substituting the agricultural, quote, sector, end quote, for the manufacturing sector as the locus of the true dynamic of the genesis of capitalism. Ultimately, the transformation of class and production relations involves all sectors of the economy. Where am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. But changes in agricultural relations are central to the process, due to the simple fact that the majority of the English population was employed in agriculture, and thus the weight of the entire class structure rested on agricultural labor. We will be attentive here to the ways manufacturing was transformed by the same process of growing market dependency in agriculture, and why this transformation took the form this transformation did, without revolutionizing manufactures until well into the 18th century. New section: Wage labor and the guilds. Wage labor in manufacturing has a history stretching back through the Middle Ages. In Europe, associations of craft artisans date from at least the 1st century BCE, as they played a role in the political upheavals of that turbulent century. These, quote, Roman guilds, end quote, or collegii, were, quote, voluntary associations of traders or employers devoted to a specific line of commerce or commodity production, end quote. Like the medieval guilds, Roman colleges had divine patrons and met in halls where social and religious activities were conducted. Solidarity and prosperity among the members was promoted. Those colleges in a position to negotiate with the state could earn some immunities and concessions which increased their attractiveness to members. Unlike medieval guilds, slaves could be members and were present, were normally left with the heavier work. Moreover, the Roman collegii, quote, did not regulate competition among their members or establish any work rules or production standards, end quote. The deurbanization that followed the collapse of the Western Empire was accompanied by a decline in the colleges. During the ensuing period of manorial agriculture, the demand for urban handicrafts fell as the manors proved to be largely self-sufficient, relying on the labor of free peasants as well as slaves. Records of the existence of medieval guilds date from the 12th century, but whether any medieval guilds can trace their origins back to Roman times remains uncertain and perhaps unlikely. With the spread of feudalism after 900 Common Era, the newfound power of the ban, quote, the power to tax, to decree, to command, and to punish, end quote, held by lords, enabled them to command from their subjects such obedience and obligations previously incumbent only on slaves or other dependent persons. Communal. Lords tied peasants to the land by forbidding the peasants' movement or flight and used access to land, means of subsistence, as a means of control, while peasant villagers fell into the position of being a universally exploited class. Those who dwelled in the towns, not being tied to the land, were increasingly free of obligations. The feudal system of agriculture promoted rapid population growth through a vast expansion of the land put under arable cultivation, and among other things creating conditions under which children were both valuable for their labor contribution and important as heirs, where title to land was hereditary. With lords looking to peasants as their primary source of surplus extraction, towns enjoyed a remarkable degree of autonomy. Thus, while rising population and commerce facilitated the growth of medieval towns, the dependence of the towns was also a direct result of the way the legal property relations of feudalism extruded non-agrarian workers whilst simultaneously generating the demand for a market in consumables, arising as a corollary to the customary and non-market-based economy of the signori. I don't know. I need to review how to pronounce these words. Or just learn how to pronounce these words. Saying them aloud makes you realize you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Although production decisions were based not on market considerations, but on the extra economic power of the lords to shape production according to their own consumption patterns, the resultant growth precipitated an increase in overall effective demand in the economy, manifested in the resurgence of trade with the East from the 10th and 11th centuries. The growth of the Italian city-states was the most outstanding manifestation of this. In such an economic environment, handicrafts were bound to flourish. Footnote. See Commonell 2000 for a more depth in discussion. Some of the ideas presented here arise from personal discussions with Professor Commonell, some of which dealt with material he has yet to publish. End of footnote. According to Epstein, it was at this juncture that wage labor became the standard form of productive employment in manufacturing. When slavery, serfdom, and dependent employment in monasteries or in the service of the state remained alternatives, the fact that urban employers in manufacturing seized upon wage labor as the principal option for Epstein remarkable. Epstein even goes so far as to suggest that this development represents the, quote, true beginnings, end quote, of modern wage labor. Epstein writes, quote, the recent controversy between Robert Brenner and Robert Brenner's many critics about the agrarian class structure, coercion, and the development of capitalism in late medieval Europe has generally been conducted without reference to the cities. The participants in the, quote, Brenner debate, end quote, have chosen to omit wage labor, and only Brenner himself recognizes its significance, though he has pushed its effects into the later Middle Ages, past the urban origins witnessed here. The first wages may actually have been paid in the countryside, but regular wage labor by contract, regulated first by the guilds and then by the commune or the state, is an urban innovation. The consequence of this development, so fundamental to the evolution of capitalism in Europe, should encourage historians of labor in later periods to acknowledge the true beginnings of their subject. End quote. The predominance that wage labor came to have within handicrafts was for Epstein bound up with the spread of the idea of contract within feudal society, one of feudalism's, quote, enduring legacies, end quote. He writes, was, quote, the idea of contract, and that the voluntary tie of mutual dependence between fighters would eventually dispose the entire society to value and respect contracts. In this view, those who did not fit into the feudal hierarchy, the townspeople and traders, simply wanted the same personal rights enjoyed by the lords, in this case the right to make a contract, end quote. Epstein, citing Bloch. Epstein appears to be suggesting that the contract between lord and vassal may have conditioned the form of contract as executed between master and his wage laborers. While this matter is worthy of further study, another explanation for the relative freedom of artisans in towns and the stimulus for their growth is the development of feudal property relations and the evolving symbiosis between the rise of medieval towns on the one hand and the extension and intensification of agrarian production under feudal agriculture on the other, together providing the basis for the Gothic golden age of cathedral building and crusades. While slavery had been tolerated by Christianity, and while the church itself owned slaves who worked on the church's land holdings, the church sought to ameliorate the harshness of slavery and was instrumental in the decline of slavery by the medieval period. The declaration of the peace of God in 989 Common Era was intended to curb the lawless warfare of the feudal barons and to offer protection to, quote, women, children, travelers, strangers, and holy clerks, end quote. Flick. During this period, the manumission of male slaves, servi, was common, but the manumission of female slaves, ensalé, was less common. Thus, even while the institution of slavery declined from the 10th century onward, evidence suggests that where it persisted, the majority of the remaining slaves were women, most laboring in agriculture, but others working in textile workshops and great houses. Footnote. The matter is complicated by the decline of the usage of the term servus as meaning slave in the 10th century, and the term services coming back into usage 2 centuries later, and no longer connotating a slave but merely servitude or serfdom. The term ancilla, however, apparently persisted and retained the connotation of women who passed on their condition as chattel to their children. End footnote. This cast doubt on the thesis advanced by Epstein that the decline of slavery occurred simultaneously with the expansion of the use of free wage labor engaged in domestic manufactures in the towns. Footnote. Renard refers to the, quote, spontaneous and independent, end quote, appearance of the guilds as though the institutions themselves could not have appeared much earlier than the earliest surviving records testifying to the guild's existence. Renard, however, sees this as but one of two opposing theories. The alternate theory suggests that guilds may have had deeper origins, whether in the Roman collegii or the scholae, in the Germanic associations resembling artificial families, in the feudal ministeriales, ministerialies, organizations of male servants in feudal households, or as modeled after the monastic orders and religious brotherhoods of the church. End of footnote. We know from surviving records that medieval guilds had emerged across Western Europe by at least the latter half of the 13th century. On the continent, the revival of Roman law in the early modern period provided a potential legal framework for the regulation of urban artisans and their associations, but it had nothing to say about apprenticeship. Instead, hereditary status was emphasized. Guilds on the continent may have found themselves, quote, in the unenviable position of the late Roman colleges, end quote, which under Roman law subordinated them to the broader interests of state, quote, if any secular ruler or arm of government was capable of enforcing its rights in Roman law, end quote. Epstein. In England, both towns and guilds received charters of incorporation from the crown. As we shall see below, in the case of merchants, the relationship between the crown and merchant companies became one of mutual interdependence with important ramifications. Guilds served their members by providing legitimacy and protection, whilst mediating between different sources of local authority, often with overlapping jurisdiction. In general, guilds strove towards monopoly control of markets and often succeeded in attaining the authority to police their craft, in such cases maintaining what Weber calls a, quote, industrial court, end quote. Weber. They also strove towards compulsory membership and the establishment of a guild district, though in England this was generally not achieved. Local monopolies could provide guild members with protection from the vagaries of market fluctuations, which no doubt increased in importance in the revival of long-distance trade advanced. Mickwitz, Mickwitz, described guild regulation of markets through the securing of local monopolies, or the seeking of a, quote, just price, end quote, fixed by custom as arising from a pervasive fear of competition. Epstein comments that, quote, in the end, this continuity of monopolistic practices convinced Mickwitz that some continuity must exist from the ancient to the medieval guild, end quote. Epstein. End of footnote. Epstein contends that Mickwitz's linking of custom with monopoly and the general attempt to limit competition by suggesting that, quote, the love of custom would just as easily go hand in hand with a zest for competition, end quote. Mickwitz. While it is true that a competition between guild masters in the same line of craft production did take place, this was to see who could outdo the others in terms of turning out a high-quality product. It was less a competition to fetch the highest price, not to sell the greatest quantity, and then lowering production costs by underselling competitors. Quote, a monopoly granted either to an individual or to a trading company, end quote, wrote Adam Smith, quote, has the same effect as a secret in trade or manufactures. The monopolist, by keeping the market constantly understocked, by never fully supplying the effectual demand, sell their commodities much above the natural price, and raise their emoluments, whether they consist in wages or profit, greatly above their natural rate, end quote. Footnote. Smith openly advocated abrogating guild statutes. Quote, the pretense that corporations are necessary for the better government of trade is without any foundation. The real and effectual discipline which is exercised over the workman is not that of his corporation, but that of his customers. It is the fear of losing their employment which restrains his frauds and corrects his negligence. An exclusive corporation necessarily weakens the force of this discipline. A particular set of workmen must then be employed, let them behave well or ill. It is upon this account that in many large incorporated towns no tolerable workmen are to be found, even in some of the most necessary trades. If you would have your work tolerably executed, it must be done in the suburbs, where the workmen, having no exclusive privilege, have nothing but their character to depend upon, and you must then smuggle it into the town as well as you can, end quote. Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 10. End of footnote. Competition to fetch the highest price based upon or leading to monopoly and competition to sell the greatest quantity by lowering price are two diametrically opposed senses of competition. Yet Epstein seems to conflate the two in tracing the origin of modern capitalist competition back to the medieval crafts. Epstein's suggestion that early forms of capitalist labor markets, market contracts, and market competition were present in the medieval period is in keeping with the tendency within historiography to project capitalist social property relations into the pre-capitalist era. By presupposing the existence of capitalist forms at the onset of high feudalism, Epstein's view would gradually accord well with those of Weber and his followers. Thus, Emanuel Wallerstein proclaims that, quote, it was in the 16th century that there came to be a European world economy based upon the capitalist mode of production. The stage was set in Europe, but not elsewhere, for the creation of a capitalist world economy, end quote. Wallerstein. Fernand Braudel states his agreement with Marx, who later revised his view, that capitalist production began in 13th century Italy. For Braudel, quote, capitalism and towns were basically the same thing in the West, end quote. Setting the clock back even further, Max Weber saw capitalism active in ancient Rome and China. As we shall see below, however, Weber did see something unique and distinct about what he called, quote, modern rational capitalism, end quote, or, quote, market capitalism, end quote. It is precisely this tendency to treat capitalism as a universal economic form of, quote, profit maximizing, end quote, present in all societies, thus rendering the term too non-specific for historical inquiry, that the present work seeks to challenge. The problem with presuming the a priori existence of the form of modern capitalism is, as Robert Brenner has argued, that the very thing most in need of explanation is itself assumed away without explanation. Brenner. One reason this tendency may be so pervasive is that scholars writing in the capitalist age will tend to take for granted the laws of capitalist society and assume them as universal laws of history. The notion that pre-capitalist and non-capitalist societies may have been governed by different laws altogether poses a challenge to the imagination of those of us who have known nothing but capitalism. Prior to the development of capitalism, societies as a rule were regulated by normative non-market principles. Human economies were, in Polanyi's terms, quote, embedded, end quote, in the larger matrix of social relations. Polanyi writes, quote, man's economy as a rule is submerged in man's social relationships. Man does not act so as to safeguard his individual interest in the possession of material goods. Man acts so as to safeguard his social standing, his social claims, his social assets. Man values material goods only insofar as those material goods serve this end. Neither the process of production nor that of distribution is linked to specific economic interest attached to the possession of goods. But every single step in that process is geared to a number of social interests which eventually ensure that the required step be taken, end quote. The guild system was no exception to this rule, as Polanyi explains, quote, under the guild system, as under every other economic system in previous history, the motives and circumstances of productive activities were embedded in the general organization of society. The relations of master, journeyman, and apprentice, the terms of the craft, the number of apprentices, the wages of the workers were all regulated by the custom and the rule of the guild and the town, end quote. Karl Polanyi. The expansion of wage labor, legal contract, and markets in the medieval period provided important ingredients in the later emergence of capitalism, but it is erroneous to instill the concept that medieval labor was increasingly unregulated and left to the play of market forces. Labor in medieval society was very much a part of the, quote, moral economy, end quote, under which social life in general was regulated according to custom. Epstein points out that the guild masters, quote, were just as concerned about competing among themselves as the guild masters were interested in protecting themselves from foreign goods, end quote. But this seems to equate wage labor under a relatively autonomous system of guilds in towns, where urban residents were effectively free of the feudal burdens of agriculture, while with a labor market of free wage laborers. The confusion is understandable. Epstein has argued that it was coincident with the disappearance of slavery from manufactures that the guilds first appeared in the historical record, and this happened in this context of an emerging feudal system characterized by the parcelization of sovereignty. Thus, unlike the Roman collegii, which under the laws of Justinian were subordinated to the larger interests of the state, the craft guilds were confronted not with a powerful and unified state, but a fractured and contested lordly sovereignty with its power base in the rural manors. This left the towns a relatively independent but contested terrain of power. Thus, according to Epstein, quote, artisans and merchants everywhere found themselves in a social setting of competing forces, end quote, calling forth the guild as an institution to negotiate on behalf of artisans. The guild statutes, however, would not spell the end of all competition or rivalry between independent masters. Far from it. In the case of cloth, leather, or armaments, the article under production, quote, had to pass through the hands of more than one craft guild, end quote. The increasing complexity of production often forced a single craft guild to split into two or more. Quote, it followed that the dividing line between guild and guild was often very doubtful, and this situation was continually giving rise to differences, quarrels, and lawsuits, some of which lasted for centuries, end quote. To take but one example, the tailors sold new clothes, but there were vendors who sold old clothes. Thus, quote, the courts labored for years and years to fix the exact moment at which a new suit became an old suit, end quote. New unending litigation was, quote, inherent in the guild system and could only disappear with the system itself, end quote. No institution could manage the conflict between guilds entirely, but guilds were precisely organizations which sought to regulate competition, not only in the interest of individual masters, but in the interest of their members as a whole. Second, only to the goal of pursuing the defense of the trade in the interest of its members was the goal of, quote, fair play, end quote. The guild sought, quote, to prevent the great from crushing the small, the rich from ruining the poor, and in order to succeed, it tried to make advantages and charges equal for all. Its motto so far was solidarity, end quote. Renard. Therefore, while the focus of the guild statutes may have been to minimize the dangers of external competition and exclusively self-interested pursuit of wealth by any individual master would soon enough appear as a, quote, external threat, end quote, in its own right. In keeping with the above quotes from Polanyi, there would have been competition between masters, but that competition's aims would not have been limited to the goal of acquiring material goods and wealth. The aims of masters also included status, prestige, reputation, and, quote, social assets, end quote, such as business connections, with suppliers and buyers, access to higher circles of authority, and the prerequisites that flow from being a well-connected and reputable individual in a town. Additionally, markets in general, whether involving international trade between different climatic zones or the exchange of goods between town and country, were more complementary than competitive. For Polanyi, the late development of competitive internal markets was the result of state intervention, as well as we shall see below, quote, state regulation continued to prevail over competitive principles, end quote. Wood. The freedom enjoyed by medieval artisans may well be a prerequisite to the later development of a market in free labor, but this relative freedom from feudal obligations did not mean that the contract between master and apprentice was a market contract. Rather, the regulation of labor through the guild typified the medieval mode of labor organization, as it upheld the customary principles of protecting both producer and consumer by helping to ensure the quality of the product. The labor process was regulated by custom. As such, artisans were shielded from full exposure to the market. Quote, a market economy can exist in a market society. A market economy must comprise all elements of industry, including labor, land, and money. But labor and land are no other than the human beings themselves, of which every society consists, and the natural surroundings in which society exists. To include labor and land in the market mechanism means to subordinate the substance of society itself to the laws of the market. End quote. Polanyi. Merchants and craftsmen sought charters of incorporation, and peasants sought to maintain their access to the means of subsistence through manorial law. Both rural and industrial producers and traders thus sought protection from exposure to the vagaries of the market through custom. Subordinating the substance of society itself to the laws of the market would have been unthinkable. The question of custom will be treated in greater detail in Chapter 10. Suffice it to say, in summary here, that Mickwitz may overstate the case when he claims that, quote, a pervasive fear of competition, end quote, accounted for the emergence of guilds, but if we substitute instead a, quote, pervasive concern with exposure to the market, end quote, we should have it about right. What may be perplexing from the perspective of those of us who live in an advanced capitalist society is that such a pervasive concern with exposure to the market could have existed. But let us try and step through the looking glass for a moment and see it from the medieval point of view. To the members of medieval guilds, it would have seemed an equally bizarre notion to suggest that master employers begin treating their apprentices as mere factors of production in the interest of maximizing the efficiency of their overall operation, lowering the price of the product and sacrificing quality to profit. This is so because it would mean not only subordinating a host of non-material aims of the operation, the transmittal of the craft, the aims of honor and prestige embodied in the, quote, masterpiece, end quote, the solidarity of the collective, but also treating the laborer's labor as a commodity. This could only happen if the material exchange of the economy were abstracted out from the structure of social relations as a whole. If land and labor became abstract land and abstract labor. While custom served to protect corporate entities such as guilds from the dangers posed by commodification, it was not a thing or a tactic to be used by workers as a hedge against some inherent urge to commodify labor. Guilds emerged in an ethos of customary social regulation and were one of many institutions operating according to customary norms of social behavior and institutional protocol, others among which include even the state. Let us apply the distinction between use value and exchange value as first popularized by Adam Smith. In pre-capitalist societies, production remained focused on producing socially necessary goods in those socially necessary goods' particular form. Production is not subordinated to capital in such a way that production is used by capital to reproduce capital's self on a larger scale. The aim of production remained focused on meeting the social need for use values. In this context, the emphasis of the guilds on producing articles of high quality served as a kind of guarantee to the consumer that each purchase would fulfill a use value need. In a market society, by contrast, the paramount interest of employers can be the maximization of exchange value at the exclusion of use values or other social goods. This situation can only come about through the triumph of exchange values over use values, which by necessity involves the commodification of all elements of production, including labor. Bathroom time. Gonna make a poop. The evolution of the guild system in England. Known variously as the, quote, crafts, quote, companies, quote, fraternities, quote, mysteries, quote, brotherhoods, the guilds were initially a way for the town crafts to deal with outsiders. As the guilds grew and adopted elaborate sets of rules, the guilds evolved into a kind of social safety net for those guilds' members, providing material aid for members when members were sick, widowed, and so on. The shortage of labor in the wake of the plague and the general crisis of the 14th century prompted the English state to act in an attempt to control the cost of labor. the Statute of Laborers of 1349 to 1350, the Royal Decree of 1360, the London Proclamations of 1383, all these appear to have been designed to control the crafts in the name of protecting the consumer, but were likely more sharply motivated by panicked employers and landlords seeking to retain labor on their estates, which were depopulated by the plague. The Statute of Laborers was set up. The Statute of Laborers. The Statute of Laborers set up a regime of wage control with hundreds of enforcers employed, quote, to tour the country and punish laborers refusing the statutory wage, end quote. Leeson, ruling in 1364 and rulings in 1364 and 1373 confirmed that the Statute of Laborers applied to both agricultural as well as craft laborers. The enforcers were frequently met with discontent and protesting. Thus, in the Peasant Revolt of 1381, craftsmen had good cause to throw in their lot with the peasants. Just 2 years after the revolt was crushed and many of the rebels slaughtered, the London Proclamation of 1383 banned unauthorized, quote, assemblies, alliances, confederacies, or conspiracies, or obligations to bind men together, end quote. In 1388, the, quote, settlement law, end quote, laid the foundation for the next 500 years, in which the state would, quote, harry the poor without alleviating their poverty, end quote. Leeson. In the same year, all guilds were ordered to register with the crown. The crafts thus lost their independence from local and national law, and their coming under state regulation changed the nature of the guilds themselves. The development was a reflection of the exceptional centralization and strength of the English state in the 14th century as compared with states on the continent. Footnote. The unity of the English state had to do with the way in which England had never experienced the parcelization of sovereignty, the devolution of the power of the ban to feudal lords, or fragmented jurisdictions. End footnote. As English trade began to expand beyond local markets, a growing separation between masters involved in trade and those directly overseeing production began to transform the guilds. Footnote. Unwin describes this transformation as a separation of the guilds into, quote, two distinct classes representing the mercantile and the industrial interest, end quote. Clearly a kind of stratification was taking place, which would ultimately place the merchants in a favorable position, but these are not, quote, classes, end quote, in the Marxian sense. They are upper strata vying for position in a system for dividing up the return from sale on a hierarchical basis according to custom. By employing the term, quote, class, end quote, Unwin seems to imply that the merchant could exploit the small master in the modern capitalist sense, and the master his workman. We must seek to understand exploitation within the guild system on its own terms, and avoid the tendency to view relationships within the guild system in terms of relationships within the modern capitalist firm. End footnote. The presence of the merchant employer within the guilds is reflected in many regulations in existence in the early 15th century. New legislation seeking to limit or suppress wages bolstered the standing of those masters who engaged in trade, and made it difficult for the poorer masters to compete. The process of stratification within the guilds was accompanied by an increase in entrance fees and other costs associated with attaining the status of master. The bar was thus raised for those who sought to pass from journeyman to master. This was a trend across Western Europe, and thus, according to Unwin, after the onset of the plague, there was in every craft an increasing number of workmen who, quote, had no prospect before them but that of remaining journeymen all their lives, end quote, and who were increasingly aware of their collective interest as apart from the interest of their employers. Within the guilds, the question of loyalty shifted from one of protecting the independence of the crafts to one of loyalty of the workman against the master. Fraternities of, quote, yeomen, end quote, suddenly appeared in the larger crafts, such as the cutlers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and drapers. Leeson contends, footnote, Unwin actually writes that they were, quote, bound together by an increasing consciousness of a class of interest that separated them from their employer, end quote. The use of the term, quote, class in conjunction with the term, quote, consciousness is problematic in this context, as it conjures up the Marxist term class consciousness. The term is clearly applicable to workers' movements in the 19th and perhaps even in the late 18th century, but to speak of, quote, classes, end quote, within manufacturing in 14th century England is anachronistic. The issue is of what defines a, quote, class, end quote, will be addressed below. Another footnote. The term yeoman has a wide range of usages, making yeoman a term lacking in precision. Yeoman's quite precise etymology is obscured by multiple suggested origins. One suggestion is that yeoman derived from yeoman, an older name for an archer, his bow being made of yew wood, thus representing military rank just below knights and squires and above foot soldiers. Thus, by the 17th century, the term applied to a naval petty officer handling supplies. Another suggestion is that yeoman is a contraction of Old English young and man, thus, quote, young man, end quote. Leeson's use of this definition suggests that this may have been how the term was understood within the crafts. Another possible derivation is from Old English guy, district, village, and thus guyman, villager. This would accord with its widespread usage to describe middle-level tenants, from freeholders to well-to-do copyholders, and later tenant farmers. The term also was used to discuss a retainer or dependent in a royal or noble household, and came to be associated with loyal service, quote, a yeoman's job, end quote. Tennyson made the first known usage of yeowoman, end quote, yeowoman, end quote, in The Foresters in 1852. Quote, then I am yeowoman, oh the clumsy word, Tennyson. End of footnote. Leeson contends that the yeomen's associations were neither the earliest form of modern trade unions nor ephemeral combinations to be immediately crushed by authority. In London, yeoman organizations were pervasive. In other cities, they were less prominent or less stable. Quote, the yeomanry was not separate but an integral yet self-contained subordinate section of the craft company. The subordination is sometimes not so obvious, and the masters and journeymen appear as equal partners, sometimes with the mayor as arbitrator, in disputes over the payment for altar lights, prices, and other, quote, necessary and good matters, end quote, or more than often over the poor fund, which was kept in a quote, great chest, locked with 3 locks, end quote, a custom in craft organization which was to last into the 19th century. The yeomanry, in fact, was a compromise, one giving the masters control over the men, and the men a form or organization which they could and did use on occasion, as well as access to funds to relieve poverty and the backing of the company to preserve their livelihood, end quote. By agreeing to such a compromise, the efforts of the journeymen to act independently of the guild, quote, were being in part sanctioned and in part counteracted by the policy of the masters in providing for them a subordinate form of organization in which any attempt at combined action was subject to oversight and control, end quote. Leeson. In many guilds, the yeomanry was put to the task of overseeing the entrance of newcomers. The Blacksmiths' Company of England, for example, granted the right of the journeymen to form a separate organization, quote, subject to an appeal to the master of the company, end quote. A representative of the journeymen was allowed to be present at the making of all covenants between employers and newcomers. A separate box was kept by the yeomen, into which half of all fines on newcomers was put, the other half going to the box of the masters. Unwin sees the emergence of the yeomanry as the development of a new, quote, class, end quote, as Unwin puts it, quote, came to form a new rank below the livery, end quote. It would seem that Unwin is right to describe the yeomanry as a, quote, rank, end quote, within a hierarchical organization, but the term, quote, class, end quote, seems inappropriate. To be sure, combinations of journeymen would have been seeking a higher standard of living, but this involved more than just a greater wage. Board and lodging were typically provided to journeymen, further allowing masters to keep them in a position of subordination. Journeymen began seeking the right to marry, to set up their own household and take work home, working on the basis of piecework. Once journeymen began contracting those journeymen's own work, once journeymen began contracting their own work, many were able to achieve near parity with those journeymen's masters. This near parity is reflected in the fact that, alongside regulation barring unqualified journeymen from becoming masters, ordinances prohibiting masters from acting as journeymen began appearing in the 15th century. Masters specializing in trade were sufficiently wealthy to lend money to the crown and were also a significant source of tax revenues. In 1411, Henry IV had banned retainers from dressing in uniform or, quote, livery, end quote, but this ban did not apply to the crafts. Over time, the privilege of wearing livery became restricted to the wealthier masters. Hence, from the mid-1400s, there were brothers, quote, in, and, quote, and brothers, quote, out of, end quote, of clothing. The brothers out of clothing paying less dues to the fraternity. Edward IV furthered the transformation of some companies into, quote, livery companies, end quote, by granting charters of incorporation separately to trading and craft guilds. The expansion of finished and unfinished wool exports in the 13th and 14th centuries, leading to greater exports of finished woolen products, facilitated this development, and by 1500 most guilds were divided into separate livery and yeomanry sections, with this development being most pronounced in London. At the same time as English manufacturers moved in the direction of, quote, putting out, end quote, weaving and spinning to the countryside under a domestic system, whilst the trading interests came to dominate the urban guilds, guilds on the continent were embroiled in bitter conflicts to retain their monopoly status. Footnote. Consistent with his view of a trans-historical capitalism, Weber sees this development as the, quote, first conflict between industrial and trading capital, end quote. As for the divergence between England and the continent, Weber points out that in Germany, towns incorporated in the principalities retained those towns' independent guild policies. In England, incorporated towns had representation in Parliament, quote, and in the 14th and 16th centuries, in contrast with later times, the overwhelming majority of the representatives came from urban circles, end quote. This would lead to the centralization of authority over guild policy and the state of apprentices. End of footnote. Why then did the trading interests come to dominate guilds so early on in England? This precocious development would appear to owe a great deal to the early centralization and unity of the English state. Since the conquest in 1066, at least, England had been the most unified Since the conquest in 1066, at least, England had been the most unified national state in Europe. This unprecedented degree of political centralization was reflected in England's, quote, impressive network of roads and water transport that united the nation to a degree unusual for the period, end quote. Wood. This unity was most clearly expressed in the common law, quote, a unified legal system administered by a corps of judges who sat in the central courts in London and took the law into the provinces when they went on circuit to hold the local assizes, end quote. Upton. English common law, a legal system protecting, quote, economic and, quote, social property relations that had arisen in the course of the feudal era, complemented the legal system protecting, quote, economic and, quote, social property. Sorry, fuck. God damn it. English common law, a legal system protecting, quote, economic and, quote, social property relations that had arisen in the course of the feudal era, complemented the legal system protecting, quote, economic and, quote, social property relations that had been integral to feudalism. By the 16th century, quote, political, end quote, property was eroding under the impact of enclosures, which involved the abolition of the customary law of the manor. As customary law was steadily and gradually extinguished, what remained was the legal framework of common law, which enshrined the abstract right to absolute private property. As they came to rely increasingly upon, quote, economic, end quote, property for their livelihood, the demilitarization of the English ruling class was greatly facilitated with the cessation of hostilities at the conclusion of the 15th century English civil wars, the so-called War of Roses. Furthermore, the cheapening of grain brought on by productivity gains in agriculture allowed wages to fall and or laborers to buy more with the wages they received. This not only facilitated the growth of the domestic market, but it also allowed a greater share of sale to go to the traders, made home-based domestic production more feasible, and may also have enabled a standard of living sufficient enough for craftsmen that they were less prone to revolt than their counterparts on the continent, where these factors were not present or were less developed. A, quote, town economy, end quote, in which the craft specialization arose in each town to supply local needs and wants, had developed prior to the 14th century. In Thomas Smith's Dialogue, a discourse of the common weal of this realm of England, written in 1549, an imaginary character laments the loss of the local market. Quote, as I knew the time when men were contented with caps, hats, girdles, and points, and all manner of garments made in the towns next adjoinage, whereby the towns then were well occupied and set a work, and yet the money paid for the same stuff remained in the country. Now the poorest young man in a country cannot be contented either with a leather girdle or leather pointus, gloves or points, gloves, knives, or daggers made nigh home. And especially no gentleman can be content to have either cap, coat, doublet, hose, or shirt made in his country, but they must have their gear from London, and yet many things thereof are not there made, but beyond the sea, whereby the artificers of our towns are idle, and the occupations in London, and specially the towns beyond the sea, are well set a work even upon our coasts or costs. Costes. End quote. I wonder what's worse, my reading of German words or reading English words from 1549. From the latter half of the 14th century, a national market in clothes had begun to emerge. The peace and security that followed in the wake of the founding of the Tudor dynasty in 1485 further facilitated the rapid extension of the national market, bringing competition to the towns. In the new context, consumers exposed to new products became more discerning and more demanding. Local crafts struggled under the pressure of both domestic and foreign competition. Smaller operations creating the same articles in the towns now had to compete with goods produced outside the town on an economy of scale. This contributed to regional specialization. Town-based craft guilds were weakened as a result, and this created the opportunity for the middleman trader to rise. As it grew to a disproportionate size, London served as the hub of England's emerging domestic economy, playing home to the largest and greatest variety of guilds. As their wealth and rank set them apart from the, quote, commonality, end quote, the livery masters in many companies claimed the right to elect the chief master and assistants. Incorporation allowed livery companies to own property, including land from which the livery could derive an additional source of income. Between 1514 and 1516, the 12, quote, great companies, end quote, of London reached an agreement on the order of precedence. On the, quote, order of precedence, end quote. The, quote, great 12, end quote, were mainly trading companies led by the mercers, the wealthiest company of all, a trade that had started among the tailors. The tailors gained royal permission to rename their guild the Merchant Tailors in 1502. This reflected who among them was now at the head of the guild. End footnote. A trend that had started among the tailors, allowing in the guildmen, end footnote, I don't know if I said that or not. A trend that had started among the tailors, allowing in the guildmen who had never learned to sew, now caught on in other crafts. Alongside apprenticeship and inheritance, a third avenue to guild membership emerged, quote, redemption, end quote, which meant buying in. The livery masters were now made up of masters turned traders, and traders who bought their way into the guild. By the mid-16th century, the appearance in some guilds of a, quote, court of assistants, end quote, a committee of the livery meeting in private, completed the process of stratification, as lesser masters were excluded and their status declined. Members of the livery could take on 2 or 3 apprentices, the chief master up to 4. But masters who had not attained livery status were restricted to 1 apprentice. Stratification also took on external forms, as wealthier companies absorbed smaller crafts and reduced their members to the status of employees. Thus the leather sellers took over the glovers, the cloth workers absorbed the shearmen's and fullers' guilds, and so on. Where one craft was overtaken by another in this way, the one doing the overtaking was typically the craft that was closer to the point of sale. So the mercers, for example, were in the perfect position to secure the market to their advantage. And the saddlers were in a position to take control of the leather dressers. As the smaller craft fraternities were absorbed into the larger companies with journeymen and small masters who were awaiting entry into the livery, forming yeomen's associations, outbreaks of, quote, variance and discord, end quote, were seen, such as that among the founders over the poor box in 1508. In 1514, a petition sent to Parliament complained of the influx of foreigners and how the foreigners' numbers would ruin the lives of English craftsmen. In 1517, the, quote, evil May Day, end quote, uprising of a crowd of 1,000 apprentices against, quote, aliens, end quote, anticipated the government's heavy-handed response to later, quote, riots, end quote, as it prompted the stationing of 5,000 troops in London. 13 of the apprentices were hanged for treason. Footnote. The attack itself had proved harmless. In all, 400 persons were arrested, and all were released except the instigator, a broker by the name of John Lincoln, and 13 others, quote, executed on the absurd ground that an attack upon foreigners when the king was at peace with all princes is tantamount to treason, end quote. By the 16th century, rural handicraft production, predominantly in spinning and weaving, had become widespread. Viewing export of half-manufactured goods as a loss of potential for urban manufacturers, efforts were made to restrict the country manufacturer from selling directly to foreign markets, so as to divert the trade through the towns. Predictably, a rivalry ensued between urban and rural producers of the same half-finished goods. The Weavers' Act of 1555 forbade country clothers to possess more than one loom or to hire out looms to others. It thus sought to keep weaving under the control of town employers by inhibiting the growth of their rural counterparts. Unwin. The English Reformation facilitated the process of stratification within the trade crafts, or the craft trades. The dissolution of the monasteries meant also the end of many religious charities run by the guilds. As in 1547, the crown asked the companies to hand over and then buy back the charities. The charities run by the monasteries themselves were not elaborate, but when the monasteries were dissolved, tens of thousands of dependents were turned out and became beggars or vagabonds to face the extraordinarily harsh and punitive vagrancy laws. It was not only the end of the charities that helped to create a human surplus. Monastic lands being sold off by the crown had not been subject to the law of the manor. Thus the addition of these lands to the emerging market for lands to enclose undoubtedly provided a great stimulus to the enclosure movement. From the 1520s and 30s, the primary type of fields to be enclosed shifted from pasture to arable. This period also saw the beginnings of the dissemination of, quote, improved, end quote, farming methods that appeared to have originated on the grange farms of the Cistercian monasteries. While other orders held peasant tendencies, the Cistercian brothers worked the fields themselves, as their Trappist successors do even today. Having no tenants, the Cistercians' farms were not subject to the regulations of customary law. The Cistercians practiced a model of grange farming that became the basis for the, quote, improved, end quote, agriculture practiced by tenant farmers working on enclosed farms. Half the fields were kept in grass and the other in grain for a number of years before those fields were converted between these up and down usages. About 28 of the 101 monasteries dissolved under Henry VIII belonged to the Cistercian order. Marx wrote that the forcible expropriation of the people received a, quote, new and frightful impulse, end quote, from the dissolution of the monasteries whose inmates were, quote, hurled, end quote, into the proletariat. One estimate puts the number of beggars on the roads in Henry VIII's time at 72,000. The estates of the church, the, quote, estates of the church, end quote, wrote Marx, quote, were to a large extent given away to the rapacious royal favorites, or sold at a nominal price to speculating farmers and citizens who drove out en masse the hereditary subtenants and threw their holdings into one, end quote. As Nichols writes, quote, lay landowners set about outbidding one another for the privilege of acquiring a share of these immediate spoils. Formerly quite restricted, the English land market became more dynamic, as wealthy men without acres, professionals and young sons of peers competed with established noblemen and courtiers for monastic estates. Most of the land ended up in the hands of local families, end quote. Nichols. The extent to which the dissolution of the monasteries facilitated both the spread of enclosures and the spread of improved farming methods is a subject for further research, but this second wave of enclosures may have been the first instance when we begin to see an emerging market in land driven by economic imperatives that are distinctly capitalist in character. By 1551, the Crown had sold off most of the lands the Crown had confiscated, squandering a precious resource and benefiting mainly private landowners. Moors. That's the name of the author, not a group of people. The private landowners are not called Moors. That's the author who wrote who was the inspiration for the last sentence. That's his last name, or her last name. Sir Thomas More had described the new breed of landlord as, quote, eager for the profits of the expanding corn and wool trade, eager for land even more than labor, end quote. The landlord no longer purchased laborers to try and force the laborers back on the land. Landlords urged them onto the roads. Among those on the roads were craftsmen without work. Masters began demanding certificates granted by previous employers for skilled craftsmen, and out of this evolved a network of, quote, traveling brothers, end quote, that would last well into the 19th century. Journeymen reacted to the stream of unemployed appearing at the gates of their towns. Their calls for restrictions on the employment of, quote, foreigners, or F-O-R-E-Y-N-S, in their trades, met with some support from the livery. Another major grievance was directed at certain masters themselves. When those masters were found to be circumventing restrictions on the number of apprentices those masters could take on. Quote, in the 1550s, 17 craft companies seeking a way out of internal dispute asked the Common Council to fix by law the number of apprentices each master might take. But this did not put an end to the problem, for the richer masters had developed a double standard. The richer masters enforced regulations which held back the journeymen and small masters from competing, while ignoring the restrictions on themselves. End quote. Leeson. Already in the time of Henry VIII, some clothers employed hundreds of spinners and weavers. The legendary John Winchcombe of Newbury was said to have employed as many as 200 weavers, all assembled in one great room. They were assisted by apprentices. Other employees of Winchcombe were said to have included 100 women employed in carding, 200 girls plying the distaff and the spinning wheel, 150 boys and girls sorting, 50 men as clippers, 80 men as dressers, 20 men at the fulling mill, and 40 men in the dye works. The numbers may be exaggerated, but the size and scope of Winchcombe's operation was extraordinary for his time, meaning that such experiments of assembling dozens or hundreds of workers under one roof were the exception which proved the rule. Manteau. Other clothers employing hundreds of spinners and weavers, employed them in their own cottages, sending them wool and taking away their cloth. The Tudor government was somewhat alarmed at these developments. Henry VIII, when encountering a string of carts laden with cloth said to belong to Winchcombe, is reported to have said, quote, "This Jack of Newbury is richer than I," end quote. Yet the government also wanted to foster the rapidly accumulating wealth of the merchants. It only sought to limit the effects of this phenomenon. State and municipal laws backed the powers of the livery. An example of this is the law of 1548-9. Edward IV, 2-3. An example of this is the law of 1548-9, which banned craft, quote, confederacies, end quote, employing secret oaths that attempted to set the price and rate for labor. This law replaced the Statute of Laborers of 1351, and was itself not repealed until 1826. The new law would only frustrate the yeomen of the companies, and certainly did nothing to settle their grievances. Queen Betty's Law. By the time Elizabeth assumed the throne in 1558, craftsmen were restive common law courts, which had always been limited to freeholders, now began to hear cases from copyholders. Yet at the same time, arguments in defense of ancient rights of commoners, as defined by custom, were increasingly treated as anomalous, effectively eclipsed by common law definitions of property ownership. Custom still applied where manorial courts remained and exercised purview over the organization and sharing of open fields. But in common law courts, appeals to custom could only defeat the legal, quote, legal principle, end quote, of ownership when the custom in question could be proven to have peaceably enjoyed local consent continuously since antiquity. Footnote. See Neff, who contrasts the way in which the royal courts in 16th century France were successfully able to extend their jurisdiction in general and specifically over industrial regulation, with the way in which similar efforts by the royal courts in England were met with opposition from common law judges who, quote, claimed that their decisions could overrule those given in the royal courts. They even went so far as to maintain that common law was superior to statute law. So jealous of their rights were the common law judges, and so influential were they in the House of Commons, that the whole system of royal jurisdiction, which the Tudors had carefully cultivated, was swept away by Act of Parliament in 1641 on the eve of the Civil War, end quote. This is in reference to the Habeas Corpus Act of 1641, which abolished the Star Chamber. Neff seems to qualify the ramifications of this statement when he writes that the proclamations, letters, patents, and orders of council of the early Stuarts were met with increasing opposition when these, quote, interfered with profits of powerful merchants and landed gentlemen interested in the progress of large-scale industry. It became almost impossible for the Privy Council to enforce any industrial regulations not embodied in statutes if they conflicted with the private interests of such merchants and gentlemen. As we shall see, the struggle between arguments in defense of profits under common law and those in defense of customary regulation under the Statute of Apprentices would rage on for more than a century and a half after 1641. End of footnote. I apologize for snorting, but it's kind of fallish today, and in fall I get allergies, but so I'm physically comfortable in the sense that I'm not sweating my wee-wee off, but I'm very allergic to what's in the air. Very seems like an exaggeration, but anyway. Back to reading, and a footnote. During the Elizabethan era, the governing bodies of the companies, increasingly dominated by the trading interests, were nonetheless bound by charters and ordinances which protected the handicraft tradition. The organized yeomen also served to preserve the craft tradition through grievances which, if the company court of assistance was not forthcoming, could be appealed to the crown. By bringing the companies under the crown's law in the 15th century, the custom of the guild was enshrined in statute law. It is possible then to view the statutes of the guilds and fraternal organizations as the urban manufacturing equivalent to rural agrarian customary law. The statutes of the guilds and fraternal associations come under full assault with the final assault on custom in the late 18th century, though, as we shall explore, there was a long history of weakening first the guilds and then the position of the worker vis-a-vis the merchant. However, as enclosures extinguished customary law one parish at a time, it was difficult to carry out a similar assault on custom in the crafts. The principal barrier to this would be the statute of apprentices, which, so long as it remained in place, gave self-organized workers' combinations a solid legal basis to continue to defend their customary practices. Footnote. Further research is necessary to explore the similarities and differences in the relationship between the common law and workers' associations on the one hand and the customary law of the manor on the other. Note that 5 Elizabeth C4 is commonly referred to both as the, quote, statute of apprentices, end quote, and the, quote, statute of artificers, end quote, and sometimes as the, quote, statute of artificers and apprentices, end quote. For our purposes, we shall use the name, quote, statute of apprentices, end quote, except where one of these names appears differently in a quotation, as this seems to be the most common usage. End footnote. Having passed an act of settlement in 1559, in an attempt to resolve the question of religion, Elizabeth's government now turned its attention to address another area of conflict. Though perhaps no more than 8% of the English population was involved in manufacturing, the manufacturing population's importance to the state was of a far greater magnitude. It should not surprise, therefore, that the Statute of Apprentices of 1563 was passed only 5 years into Elizabeth's reign. As in the previous century, the pressures on the small masters and lesser companies were growing. Increasingly dependent upon the merchants for both supply and sale, small masters saw their share of the return from the product shrink as the merchant share increased. Meanwhile, lesser companies continued to be absorbed by larger companies. The girdlers amalgamated with the pinners in 1568. The blacksmiths absorbed the spurriers in 1571, and also attempted to absorb the clockmakers and so on. We know from the example of the cloth workers that the absorption of one craft by another was not always a hostile takeover. Unwin speculates that in the case of the cloth workers who in 1566 volunteered to turn over all their members engaged in cloth finishing to the merchant tailors, one of their main motives in making the offer may have been that releasing the workers would have freed them of the responsibility of poor relief for the craftsmen and their families. By passing the Statute of Apprentices, Elizabeth's government sought to check the growing social rift within the trades by balancing the interest of apprentices, yeomen, and livery masters. In 61, quote, remembered, end quote, trades, the rule of 7 years' apprenticeship was to be enforced. Uncontrolled entry into the crafts, it was thought, could mean that, quote, men, like ravenous fishes, would feed on one another, end quote. Footnote. Lesson attributes this quote to the character of Sir Thomas More in the play Sir Thomas More. primary authorship of the play in question has since been attributed not to Shakespeare but to Anthony Munday. Shakespeare is thought to have contributed but 3 pages. End footnote. Enforcement of this rule would keep down the wages of agricultural labor and would protect journeymen from any flood of newcomers or from cheaper, untrained rivals. The master craftsman would be protected from a rush of apprentices seeking to replace that master craftsman. The public and traders would benefit from the protection of the quality of the product, and masters were protected by the rule that journeymen must serve until the age of 24. A third rule was that before any extra apprentice was taken on, there should be work for 3 journeymen. This enshrined the earlier custom of many trades allowing 1 apprentice for a master, 2 for a liveryman, and 3 for the company master. Workshops employing the correct proportion became known as, quote, legal or, quote, fair shops. But in the rapidly expanding textile trades, employing ever-increasing numbers of workers in rural areas outside the scope of guild regulation, the law could not have been popular with the great masters who anyway tended to disregard the law. The statute also enshrined the requirement that new workers provide a certificate from their previous master, and it stated the terms of the 1549 Act prohibiting working people from setting their own pay, leaving the justices of the peace the power to limit wages. The goals of Queen Betty's Law, as it became known among the crafts, were to stabilize the various strata in the manufactures, to ensure greater regularity of employment, and to, quote, bring wages into a steadier and more equitable relation to prices, end quote. By seeking uniformity of wages throughout individual crafts, the statute had the effect of benefiting the least paid workers, but as wages were more often leveled downwards than upward, most journeymen stood to lose and masters stood to gain. Footnote. The practice of limiting wages under the Statute of Laborers of 1349-51 had fallen into disuse by the time of Henry VIII, who exempted employees from compliance. But inflation in the 1540s once again required the government to revive the practice. Under Elizabeth, the Statute of Apprentices was passed with a host of legislation in 1563, quote, more such legislation than had ever been enacted in any session, including anti-enclosure legislation, reform of poor relief, licensing of middlemen and foodstuffs, end quote. The statute regulated contracts, wages, compulsory recruitment of labor, and guild apprenticeship of 7 years. The offenses it outlined were paying and receiving excessive wages, refusing to work. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the legislation may have been employed more often to control high wages, but order was also an imperative, and so a, quote, customary minimum wage in times of decaying trade, end quote, or dearth was sometimes recognized and enforced. End of footnote. In general, the new legislation strengthened the position of the masters over journeymen. Quote, the journeymen had lost all effective share in the yeomanry organization, and the only modes of common action open to them were either to appeal over the heads of the masters to the Court of Assistance, or to form an illegal combination and to strike. The second of these methods was ineffectually resorted to as early as 1565. End quote. Unwin. For the next century, journeymen's associations would decline into relative obscurity. The decline of the power of the town guilds, however, did not mean that urban manufacturing was faltering, nor did the expansion of rural manufacturing come at the expense of urbanization, as was the trend on the continent. The typical Elizabethan company had achieved a compromise between the potentially conflicting interests of masters and traders. The craft masters had agreed to refrain from interfering with trading operations of the merchants in the company, whilst traders would, quote, sanction the regulations designed to preserve the status of the craftsman, end quote, including rights of search and seizure. Footnote. Unwin refers to the non-interference in trading operations by small masters as, quote, freedom of trade, end quote. The merchant companies that arose out of this period, however, enjoyed royally sanctioned monopolies over markets, and thus we should be careful not to confuse internal non-interference with, quote, free trade, end quote. In the course of the 17th century, the great merchant companies would come under attack by merchant interlopers who favored, quote, free trade, end quote, meaning markets open to virtually all comers. The use of the term, quote, free trade, end quote, in the 17th century is not to be confused with the term free trade's later use as the, quote, doctrine of free trade, end quote, which advocated the lowering of tariffs and other forms of regulation in international trade to stimulate overall trade and investment, end quote. End of footnote. I don't know why I said end quote. There's no quote there. Just end of footnote. That's what I meant to say. But with the ever-expanding pool of journeymen held in check by the new framework of legislation securing the position of the masters, the industrial and commercial interests were now free to contend with one another, giving the companies a new tension and dynamic that was destined to transform the nature of the craft organization once again in the coming century. For Unwin, the statute of apprentices, quote, presents two different aspects to the historical student, end quote. On the one hand, the statute of apprentices was a monument to the progress of national unity in England, reflecting also the growing centralization of the English state. Footnote. For Unwin, the statute of apprentices, being the first such legislation to cover the whole country, reflected England's national unity in contrast to France. He notes that the fiscal motive underlying French edicts was, quote, conspicuously absent, end quote, in the English case, end footnote. Where earlier legislation had dealt only with specific regions or sectors of the economy, the Act of 1563 attempted to regulate virtually all localities and working populations. On the other hand, quote, the Act presented a vain endeavor to give fixity and permanence to a condition of things which already in great part belong to the past, end quote. As Leeson puts it, the statute of apprentices, quote, was a hostage to the future, end quote. Although the Act broadly covered all forms of employment, the title, quote, statute of apprentices, end quote, implied a focus on employment in the crafts. This is significant because it was precisely by seeking to preserve the hierarchical and normative system of the guilds that the Act most effectively sustained an area of the economy governed by customary forms of regulation. The Act should perhaps be seen not so much as a conscious attempt to preserve the old order as an effort to set a modern and thus national framework for an economy in transition. The economic context in Tudor and Stuart England. Jesus Christ. I'm trying to get this coffee thing open. My travel mug. Come on, you little bastard. There we are. Nice snap. I suppose that's good, though, that I can't open. I guess that means it's really keeping it airtight, keeping the coffee hot, which, it's probably the most important thing in my life is that the coffee stays hot. The economic context in Stuart and Tudor times. During the Tudor period, multiple and varying forces and factors were at work in transforming the basic contours of the English economy. These included a rapidly growing population, a revolution in prices, a deepening national market reflecting regional specialization and evolving national unity, and a shortage of employment. From the late 15th century, the population of England and Wales began to rise again following the extreme population decline after the plague, which had struck Marseille by the end of 1347 and spread northward, leaving only tiny pockets of Europe untouched. It reached London by the end of 1348. The recovery of the population in Europe only began in the 16th century. In England, population growth began to increase from the 1520s to the 1540s, and only slowed again from after 1640 or 1650, after which the population remained stable or rose only slightly for about a century. Unlike the continent, however, England did not experience any serious population decline after 1650. I apologize for that burp, and the sniffling, and maybe occasionally the farting. I'm a fucking disaster. We could point to several factors conditioning this period of population increase. First, as noted previously, the end of the Wars of the Roses and the founding of the Tudor dynasty brought about stability and the chance for England's economy to grow and diversify. England was thus able to take full advantage of the rise of trade in Europe generally. Secondly, accompanying and partly in response to this rise of trade was a pan-European growth of population. This growth in population included the rapid growth of cities. London was exceptional in this regard. With a population of around 33,000 in 1500, London had grown to become the largest city in Europe by 1650, with a population of perhaps 400,000, surpassing Paris. Footnote: Coleman, 1977. Without the increased use of coal, the growth of London would have been limited. Coal supplied warmth for houses and fueled industries for producing necessities for urban subsistence, soap and salt, for example, as well as those luxuries that made urban life tolerable, even preferable: glass, sugar, beer. London's growth set in motion a self-reinforcing mechanism of growth in the economy. Its expansion demanded more coal as well as bigger breweries and soap boilers. Increasing demands for coal necessitated deeper mines, larger ships, and improved transport routes. During the 17th century, the number of collier ships jumped from 400 to 1,400, the average cargo load from 60 to 70 tons to 250 to 300 tons. Wilson, 1984. We must bear in mind, however, that coal was a secondary precondition to the growth of London, the first being food and the increasing productivity of farming that enabled the local farms to keep production at pace with London's ever-expanding demand for grain. End footnote. With the growth of population and rampant monetary inflation came a major expansion of grain production across Europe, with high prices attracting new investment. Thirdly, and crucially, the uniquely English development of tenant farming on enclosed fields also contributed to the growth of population. Improved farming methods began to be adopted widely on enclosed farms in the first half of the 16th century, thus coinciding with the onset of population growth. Improved farming meant higher yields per acre, and thus greater productivity. France produced an overall greater yield than England, for it had a much larger population. However, while customary law still prevailed in French agriculture, England was outstripping France in output per acre. Wood. In absolutist France, the taille, a tax assessed on the village community collectively, increased by 300% from 1620 to 1640, sparking a series of peasant revolts. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that word taille correctly. It's the taille, Taille, and it kind of is, I think it's the same way that the latter portion of Bataille's last name is pronounced in French, so I'm going to roll with that, but just keep in mind that I may be wrong because my French pronunciation is not great. In Eastern Europe, high grain prices compelled lords not to adopt improved methods, but to reintroduce serfdom in the face of a labor shortage. The Dutch played a lead role in transporting and reselling grain from Eastern Europe. However, when the Second Agrarian Depression struck, lasting to 1720, the Dutch were hit hard and England alone continued to advance in agriculture. Upton.
It would be impossible to sort out the contributions each of these different factors made to population growth during the period in question. However, the enclosure movement and the corresponding extinguishing of customary law and common rights were undoubtedly principal factors in displacing significant numbers of people from the rural areas. This in turn may help to explain the exceptional growth of London. It was also an underlying cause of England's vagrancy problem, which in turn helped to prompt the implementation of Elizabethan poor laws. The poor laws could be seen as a kind of early welfare system used to buffer English society from the dislocating effects of an emerging capitalist economy with built-in structural unemployment. Footnote. Slack writes that, quote, 18th century England was already in attitude and practice a welfare state, end quote. End footnote. Polanyi comments that the poor laws, together with the statute of apprentices, made up a, quote, code of labor, end quote, through the poor laws, while also a national policy, were administered locally at the parish level. Simultaneous with the growth of population was a period of rising prices. In the 2 centuries from 1450 to 1650, prices of basic household goods rose steadily. Grain prices increased more sharply between 1550 and 1650. The apparent trend based upon limited evidence suggests that wages rose about threefold between 1500 and 1650, while cereals rose by sevenfold. Coleman. For agricultural and industrial laborers, then, it was likely a time of decreasing real purchasing power and thus decreased standards of living. Coleman notes three main forces at work behind the price rise. The first is short-term debasement of the coinage by the crown, which can only account for temporary increases. The second factor of inflation was inflow of bullion from Spanish America. The inflationary effects of this influx were felt across Europe, with population growth as the third factor. England was caught up in a pan-European economic crisis. The impact of Spanish bullion could only have been felt after the 1560s, when a new technique of extracting silver from its ore made mining operations in Bolivia and Mexico practical. As Spain made its payments increasingly in bullion, Spanish bullion began circulating rapidly throughout Europe. Much of it was used to mint new coins. This dramatic increase in the volume of money fueled the spiral of increasing prices. It also fueled a new attitude on the part of increasingly wealthy merchants towards money making, that money begets money. This change in attitude reflected in a new attitude towards craftsmen. Quote, to the merchants who made the fortunes and dominated the trading life of the nation, it must have seemed an outrage that their doings should in any way be governed by meetings of craftsmen and small shopholders, because they were all nominally members of the same company, and that men whom they could buy and sell 10 times over should lay down how many men should be employed, how many boys apprenticed, and how thus the market should be divided, end quote. High prices meant hard times for working men and women, the extraordinary opportunities for those who handled money. High prices meant hard times for working men and women and extraordinary opportunities for those who handled money. Despite the important role played by the influx of Spanish bullion, however, only the recovery of population since the devastation of the plague could explain the length of the price increase and the disparity between food prices and industrial prices. At the village level, population pressure meant several things at once: increasing population density, expansion of the area under cultivation and/or subdivision of tenancies, a surplus of increasingly younger agricultural laborers, and migration of labor out of the village. The landless unemployed grew so much that in 1573 the House of Commons complained of the increase of, quote, rogues, vagabonds, and thieves, end quote. The demand for commercial agricultural produce increased dramatically, as an increasing number of people no longer produced their own subsistence goods. Whatever gains were made in agriculture productivity, they were insufficient to keep up with the pace of demand, and hence the high inflationary trend in agricultural products. Quote, conversely, end quote, writes Coleman, quote, the supply of manufactured goods was markedly more elastic, end quote. Continuing, he writes, quote, in a few industries, there were technical advances which helped to restrain real costs as output increased. Far more important, however, was the highly labor-intensive nature of much industrial production, often skeptical to real reductions in real costs by organizational changes, notably an extension of, quote, putting out, end quote, techniques. A substantial increase in population thus came as a great economic blessing to producers, especially of such goods as textiles. Their price consequently did not rise nearly so much as did the price of the land-intensive agricultural products, end quote. Coleman. East Anglia developed an extensive putting-out system in the 16th century. It would not develop in Lancashire until the 17th century. Both the growth of London and the rural handicraft manufacturing that grew up alongside it were fueled by a surplus population in search of employment. London's expansion meant ever greater demand to stimulate agricultural and industrial production, some of that production centralized and or large in scale, as we shall discuss below. Overseas economic expansion in the form of colonialism and trading by the overseas merchant companies facilitated the expansion and gave further encouragement to regional specialization. The domestic market continued to deepen. As patterns of demand changed, combined with an overall expansion of trade, a gradual decline set in on the guilds. The guilds were unable to assert their authority over rural production or over new lines of production where those new lines of production appeared. The decline of guild authority and the changes accompanying the decline of guild authority, quote, was not a rapid or countrywide movement proceeding at an even pace. In many provincial towns, changes came only later in the 16th century, end quote. The decline of guilds from the 16th century on, that quote was from Coleman. Wait, there's a footnote. Ogilvy points out that the decline of the guilds in England and the Low Countries in the 16th century occurred far in advance of the decline of guilds in other parts of Europe. The gradual disappearance of guilds in France did not begin until the early part of the 18th century. Quote, almost everywhere else in Europe, proto-industries, rural handicrafts were regulated by corporate groups of, quote, capitalists, end quote, and often also of, quote, workers, end quote, well into the 18th century, end quote. Rural handicraft workers also formed their own guilds. It would be instructive to examine any attempts by rural handicraft workers in England who may have attempted to form rural handicraft guilds from the 16th to the 18th centuries, as it might tell us more about the social relations and economic forces which militated against their emergence generally. Hudson notes that the expansion of rural manufacturing in England, quote, did not appear to occur at the expense of urbanization, end quote, as it did on the continent. End footnote. The decline of the guilds from the 16th century on did not mean, however, that urban manufacturing faltered. Quote, neither was there such a clear division of labor in Europe as there may have been in many other parts of Europe. Quote, neither was there such a clear division of labor in England as there may have been in other parts of Europe, between towns providing mercantile, financial, and finishing services, and the countryside providing cheap family labor for mass production processes. The rapid growth of urban villages, unincorporated towns and suburbs in London, and other large towns in the 18th century was associated specifically with expansion of employment in the low-wage, unregulated domestic and small workshop trades, end quote. Coleman. Although the English guilds, particularly those outside of London, had begun to decline, struggles of over the regulation of the craft trades would continue. Sorry, just making sure I'm still recording. I think I'm going to read a little longer today. Trying to commit to 10 pages a day of this book so it doesn't scare me, because it's enormous, and it's probably the biggest history book I've ever read, which I'm ashamed to say. But, well, it's a huge book, so actually I don't feel ashamed to say. But it's scary nonetheless. But, I think it's important to push oneself intellectually and in other ways as well, and not just retread familiar ground, because it makes you feel good to retread familiar ground, because you're like, I've acquired expertise in this thing that I didn't used to have expertise. Now I'm just going to reinforce that expertise as opposed to trying to stretch oneself out further and reach into areas one doesn't already know a lot about. Anyway, still recording, so good. Don't want to be talking to the wind for half an hour plus. Neff's, quote, early Industrial Revolution, end quote. Arnold Toynbee's lectures of the 1880s conduced to cement the use of the term Industrial Revolution to describe the emergence of industrialization in England from about 1760. Toynbee's object was to lay out the comparatively backward state of the English economy in 1760 in light of what was to come. Thus in 1760, writes Toynbee, quote, the old industrial system obtained in England, none of the great mechanical inventions had been introduced, the agrarian changes were still in the future, end quote. Toynbee. Wool remained the primary export and cotton production was minimal. Quote, England in 1760 was still to a great extent under the medieval system of minute and manifold industrial relations. That system was indeed decaying, but it had not yet been superseded by the modern principle of industrial freedom, end quote. For Toynbee, quote, the essence of the Industrial Revolution is the substitution of competition for the medieval regulations which had previously controlled the production and distribution of wealth, end quote. Half a century later, John Neff challenged this line of thinking, arguing that, quote, the concept of a, quote, industrial revolution, end quote, would seem to be especially inappropriate as an explanation of the triumph of industrial civilization in Great Britain. It gives the impression that the process was especially sudden when it was, in all probability, more continuous than in any other country. End quote. Neff cites a, quote, enormous economic expansion beginning about the middle of the 16th century, end quote, in, quote, large-scale enterprise, end quote. In a later article, Neff states his position more forcefully when he declares that, quote, we have been mistaken about the time when the Industrial Revolution began, end quote. In making this claim, Neff certainly deserves recognition as a pioneer anticipating by half a century the outpouring of scholarship that rejects the classical Toynbeean view of the British Industrial Revolution. From the 1540s onward, England saw the development of enterprises on a scale England had not hitherto seen. The new or expanding old lines of production included coal, salt, glass, ships, alum, soap, cannons and gunpowder, mined metals, metalwares, paper, copperas, sugar, saltpetre, calamine, iron rods, metal wire, as well as lime, starch, and brewed beverages. Coleman. The production of sugar and brass was new to England, as was paper making. In the 1540s, Britain was importing all or virtually all of its paper. In the 1550s, paperworks began to appear, and, quote, foreign workmen were obviously the main source of the necessary skills, end quote. Footnote. The first paper mill recorded was at Fen Ditton, near Cambridge, built in 1557. In 1588, a German immigrant named John Spielmann, or Spielmann, John Spielmann, set up a paper mill at Dartford, Kent. He employed German workmen. The following year, Spielmann Spielman was granted a monopoly over the making of all white writing paper in Britain. But Spielman apparently had trouble enforcing the patent in the face of other mills attracting away his laborers. Even if they were proving difficult to enforce, the granting of monopoly rights in paper manufacturing serves to underscore the point, to be made below in our discussion of mining, that 16th and 17th century manufacturing continued to be regulated in, quote, extra economic, end quote, ways. In other words, a system of industry regulated by the free play of market forces, industrial capitalism, had not yet come into existence. End of footnote. By the 1720s, about 2/3 of domestic consumption was being supplied by domestic manufacturers. Other products like saltpeter, I don't know how to fucking say that, saltpetre. I guess I should know what that is, or maybe you know what that is. Hats off to you. I don't. Other products like saltpeter and gunpowder had been produced in England previously, but in insignificant amounts. The older lines of manufacturing undergoing extensive changes drew in large numbers of workers. In copper smelting, steel making, mining and metallurgy, brick making and glass making, immigrant craftsmen from the continent brought many of the requisite skills and know-how to enable technical advance and expansion of scale. Neff cites three major technical developments that facilitated the growth of large-scale manufacturing units in the century before 1640. The introduction of this new, quote, capitalistic, end quote, industries, the application of old technical processes to new industries, and the, quote, discovery and application of new technical methods, end quote. For most of these newly expanding industries, the new development, according to Neff, was the increasing use of coal as a power source. The use of coal could lower the cost of production, thus aiding in market expansion. Moreover, the introduction of coal as a power source made possible the introduction of essential technical advances. New techniques in such lines of production as glass, bricks, or malt yielded a product, quote, more suitable for commercial purposes than that obtained from fires of charcoal, wood, and straw, end quote. The substitution of coal for wood also eased regional shortages of wood, freeing up timber for shipbuilding and other wood-based production. According to Fernand Braudel, quote, the decisive feature of this revolution, end quote, was the increasing dependence on coal use, precipitating a vast expansion in coal mining, 35,000 tons in 1560, rising to 200,000 tons by 1600. Under the reign of Elizabeth I, mines grew in terms of output, the numbers of workers employed, and the scale of investment. Quote, by a legal decision rendered in 1566, before the great expansion of the coal industry, all minerals except those containing gold or silver were excluded from the regale. During the next century and a half, the development of coal mining led to the digging of pits and adits and making of paths, cartways, and wagonways in hundreds of manors in many countries. End quote. The use of coal spurred technical advance, or the quote was Fernand Braudel. The use of coal spurred technical advance by facilitating the development of new techniques or posing technical problems that required a solution. Charles Wilson notes that by the end of the 17th century, quote, substantial progress had been made towards a solution of the technical problems created by the use of coal instead of wood, end quote. In, quote, every industry save one, iron, end quote. Nevertheless, ironworks grew in scale, employing blast furnaces and water-powered bellows. Braudel has expressed puzzlement as to why this so-called, quote, first industrial revolution, end quote, should have taken England from being an industrial laggard to being a leading industrial nation in Europe by the eve of the Civil War. Quote, but why did this happen in England when all the major innovations of the period, I am thinking, for example, of blast furnaces, the various apparatus used for underground mining, tunnels, ventilation systems, pumps, and winding gear, were all borrowings demonstrated to the English by German miners hired for the purpose. Why England, when it was the craftsmen and workers of more technically advanced countries, Germany, the Netherlands, but also Italy for glass, and France, wool and silk textiles, who contributed the necessary techniques and skills for the establishment of a series of industries quite new to Britain: paper mills, powder mills, glass mirrors, cannon founding, alum and copperas, green vitriol, sugar refining, saltpeter, and so on. End quote. Quote, the remarkable thing is that when these industries did arrive, England should have developed them on a scale hitherto unknown. The growing size of firms, the dimensions of the buildings, the rising number of workers, soon running into tens or even hundreds, the comparatively high level of investment, which was reaching thousands of pounds, whereas the annual wage of a worker was about only £5. All these were completely new and indicate how extraordinary was the expansion of English industry in this period. Footnote. As it suits his thesis, Neff expresses less surprise and comments on this change simply as a matter of fact. Quote, what marks off the economic history of Great Britain in this period from that of her continental neighbors, end quote, Neff writes, quote, is both the extent of general economic development and the difference in the kind of industry which developed most strikingly. A country which had remained throughout the Middle Ages economically in a backwater, rose to a first place in the front rank, end quote. End of footnote. Burdell is apparently as impressed as Neff is over these developments, but it should be noted that while 17th century England did see this remarkable growth of industries that for England were unprecedented in size, similar examples from the continental powers can be cited. Moreover, it was not until the latter half of the 18th century that England took a decisive lead. Neff's thesis rests on the presupposition that there is something inherently, quote, capitalistic, end quote, about large-scale manufacturing in the 16th and 17th centuries. Likewise, Burdell sees that the adaptation to coal as a power source led to a, quote, concentration of the workforce and inevitably of capital, end quote. Neff. But were these larger firms specifically capitalist, and if so, why? According to D.C. Coleman, centralized production is necessitated by any of four conditions: the immobility of fixed capital equipment, the immobility of a power source, as in wind or falling water, the immobility of the raw material in an extraction process, or by an assembly process requiring multiple parts to be fashioned into larger objects, such as a ship. Quote, these conditions, end quote, writes Coleman, are, quote, technical, not economic. These conditions tell us nothing whatever about the optimum economic size or scale of any plant, end quote. For Coleman, the larger operations employing hundreds of workers were the exception that proved the rule. He finds in Neff's thesis, quote, a great deal of nonsense, end quote, and a tendency to exaggerate. Of the bewildering variety of types of mills to emerge, quote, only a very few gave rise to large enterprises or had more than half a dozen or so workers dependent on them. Many a mill was owned by the landlord. Sometimes in the early period it was still the manorial mill to which the tenants brought their corn for grinding. But as such practices declined, the mill was often rented out for more overtly industrial purposes, end quote. Coleman. Moreover, many of these operations failed when they reached a size that presented insuperable technical and managerial difficulties. By the 1620s, the larger textile operations run by the Winchcombe and Dunham families in Newbury had been abandoned, quote, due to changes in the commercial and regulatory climate, end quote. Jackson. The Mines Royal and the Mineral and Battery Works, both set up in 1658 and later, quote, let to farm, end quote, serve as examples. Quote, Among the causes of failure, writes Sidney Pollard, quote, must be reckoned technical difficulties and the inability to efficiently transplant continental methods, overestimation of the yield of copper mines, and inability to deal effectively with ore, which was different in composition from German ores. In addition, end quote, in addition to high costs, poor supervision, waste in the form of bribery, inability to raise capital, fraud, and sheer, quote, mismanagement, end quote. Pollard. Some of these largest operations that did survive, such as the shipbuilding industry and the naval dockyards, were not based on private enterprise, but were dependent upon state patronage. State demands for ships, iron for cannons, and other metals played a major role in facilitating the growth of large, centralized operations in manufacturing from the mid-16th century. What can also account for the ability of new lines and techniques to thrive in England, where they were less successful on the continent, is the unprecedented expansion of England's domestic market. The growth of a highly productive agriculture produced on land farmed under economic leases or by capitalist tenant farmers, responding to the market imperatives, supported a growing domestic economy and regional specialization. New lines of manufacturing and new techniques in this context would have a high probability of success in an economy where disposable incomes were on average increasing and where the consumer market was beginning to expand and diversify below the level of elite consumption of luxury goods. Soap, glass, and salt are all goods that the common folk of England were consuming in greater numbers. The importance of Neff's thesis is that his emphasis on the emergence of, quote, new, end quote, industries helps to frame the question. What economic forces were at work in facilitating the development of such new industries in England? Neff highlights a significant development of large-scale enterprise long before the Industrial Revolution and draws what seems an obvious conclusion that the evolution of industrial capitalism had a much longer and extended history than is generally imagined. Capitalism's origins long predate 1760, but Neff is focused on the form and not the process. Moreover, Neff is making a case for a pan-European, quote, early industrial revolution, end quote, which we dispute. In spite of this, however, Neff repeatedly finds examples of ways in which England was unique. Furthermore, Neff's work focuses more or less exclusively on the growth of large-scale manufacturing. He does note the, quote, growth of an elaborate network of middlemen who supplied the materials upon which thousands of domestic workpeople labored at their spinning wheels and looms, end quote, which he views as, quote, so remarkable in the late 16th and early 17th centuries that the changes in the face of industrial Lancashire were scarcely less important than between 1760 and 1832, end quote. Yet Neff himself had little to say about the development of rural cottage manufacturing. This was a subject to be picked up later by others in what became the literature on the, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote. Another theoretical approach, to which we shall turn momentarily, that seeks to trace the origins of the Industrial Revolution through pre-industrial manufacturing. If the implication of Neff's thesis is that it should be possible to trace a continuous development of, quote, factories, end quote, and industrial capitalism from this period, the thesis is untenable. Large-scale production could be found in Roman times, but these did not give rise to an industrial revolution. Neff's work does not bring us closer to explaining the timing of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. He emphasizes the, quote, importance, end quote, of these developments. So it bears asking, in what way were these developments particularly important? What did the expansion of the scale of some industrial operations in the 16th and 17th centuries contribute to the rapid growth of English industrial output in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? The contention here is that the emergence of large-scale, mostly state-run enterprises in 16th century England did not by itself generate the momentum, the social dynamic, capable of yielding the dramatic burst of English industrial output in the late 18th century, and while developments like the spread of the blast furnace were necessary conditions for that, quote, revolution, end quote, in manufacturing, they were far from sufficient. The emergence of large-scale manufacturing enterprises by the mid-17th century reflected the increasing strength and coherence of the English state, its strength in part premised upon the increasing scope and depth of the domestic market. Since the numbers of those employed in manufactures remained relatively low when compared to the rapid growth of factories in the later 18th century, it does not appear to be the case that these, quote, early factories, end quote, were absorbing large numbers of peasants turned wage laborers displaced by the process of enclosures and expanding agrarian capitalism, even if they stood to benefit from the resulting cheapness and wider availability of wage labor. Indeed, there were large-scale industrial enterprises in France, Sweden, and other nations where agrarian capitalism was not developing. Moreover, English exports continued to be dominated by textiles. By 1701, woolen still accounted for 2/3 of British exports. It is thus difficult to see how the expansion of mining and other industries that Neff cites as part of his, quote, early Industrial Revolution, end quote, might have brought about an overall transformation of the economy sufficient to merit the, quote, revolution, end quote, label. As Coleman states, the commonality such industry share is the nature of the technical process itself, which does not allow dispersal of workers and requires concentration. However, the robustness of these industries in 17th century England can be explained at least in part by the development of new market imperatives that necessitated a transformation of agrarian production, resulting in an agrarian capitalism and regional specialization in a growing domestic market. By calling for a protracted view of the Industrial Revolution as a long-term process, Neff's work, perhaps unintentionally, places an emphasis on the historical process that led to the Industrial Revolution. This suggests that the whole confusion about whether the Industrial Revolution was a slow or sudden development confuses causal process with the outcomes of the change itself. Neff tells us that the centralization of production in these large manufacturing operations made capitalism inevitable because large sums were needed for investment in fixed capital, including techniques in some industry. Yet Neff tells us virtually nothing about the social relations involved in production. Are we to imagine the presence of a class of capitalist employers emerging from this period? Footnote. Some questions for further research remain. What did these industries contribute in terms of experience with financing large-scale enterprise or labor management? To the extent that valuable experience in large-scale industry was gained, by whom was it gained exactly? End footnote. To address this question, let us consider the positions of several authors who, when specifically examining medieval and early modern mining operations, have answered this question in the affirmative. Quote, capitalism, end quote, in medieval and early modern mining. Max Weber has argued that the increasing concentration in mines from the 13th to the 17th centuries meant increasing capital requirements necessitating capitalists employing wage laborers. According to Weber, in the 13th century, the strength of German miners induced landed proprietors to grant, quote, free mountains, end quote, whilst in England, mining rights were at this time reserved to the crown. The implication, footnote. Some questions refer, Neff cites a legal decision of 1566 under Elizabeth I as opening up ores other than precious metals to private mining. According to Weber, the change came later under Charles I. End footnote. The implication seems to be that German mining became capitalist from a very early period, well before England. Louis Mumford has similarly suggested that the Fuggers of Germany, an exceptionally wealthy mercantile family of the 14th century with extensive mining interests, were among the first true capitalists. Mumford writes, quote, Jacob Fugger II is the very model of the pure capitalist. Fugger's dominance symbolizes the perversion of life economy into money economy, end quote. End footnote. The Fuggers were a German merchant family who traded in silk, spices, and fine arts. By 1502, Jacob Fugger was, quote, the foremost fiscal agent of Rome, end quote, and collected papal revenues across Europe. Jacob Fugger had entered into a partnership with the German mining engineer Johann Terzo in 1494. The Fugger-Terzo Trading Company came to operate an extensive network of copper and silver mines leased in Germany, Tyrolia, and Hungary, employing hundreds of workers in mines and smelting works in what was, prior to the opening of the mines in South America, quote, probably the largest scale business which had developed to that time, end quote. Strider. Enjoying extensive patronage and little competition, Fugger nearly achieved a global monopoly on the copper trade in the first quarter of the 16th century. Did such an amassing of merchant capital translate into, quote, capitalist, end quote, relations of production in the workplace? According to John Flynn, quote, the mines, of course, under the feudal system were the property of the Duke, the owners holding them as feudal grants. The Duke, therefore, was entitled to share of all the copper and silver taken out of them by the operators, end quote. Footnote. The Fuggers were active traders out of Antwerp, a key hub of new activity during the period when the center of trade was shifting from the Mediterranean to the northwest of Europe. Ehrenberg comments, quote, we begin to hear of fairly large financial transactions on the Fuggers' part in Antwerp. Hitherto, the factory there, which had a house to itself in 1508, had really only been used for dealing in commodities, a business where pepper figured alongside of copper and silver, end quote, adding in a footnote, quote, factory is used in the 18th century sense of a depot, end quote. This again suggests that the Fugger operation was largely governed by the logic of mercantile operations. It also reminds us that terms like, quote, factory, end quote, can have a wide variety of meanings. End footnote. The fact that the leasing agreement retained a feudal character suggests that the mode of labor organization also continued to follow long-standing customary practices. In other words, there is little evidence to suggest that 15th and 16th century mine owners wrested control over the labor process away from their laborers in the same manner as English textile mill owners did in late 18th century England. In fact, in English mining, the struggle over control of the labor process persisted well into the latter half of the 19th century. It is not surprising, however, that Weber would identify such operations as capitalists, since Weber finds capitalism wherever he finds trade. Weber defines, quote, a capitalist economic action, end quote, as an action which rests on the expectation of profit from the utilization of opportunities for peaceful exchange, end quote. Weber. In effect, then, capitalism is equated with the accumulation of wealth and with trade. Wherever you find a flourishing trade, as in ancient Rome or China or even Babylon, you find capitalism. As Weber explains, quote, merchants have existed in all parts of the world, wholesale and retail, local and foreign. There have been money lenders of all kinds and banks with a variety of functions. Wherever public bodies have had mass monetary finances, the money lender has appeared. Whether in Babylon, Greece, India, China, or Rome, he has financed above all wars and piracy, contracts and building of all kinds. This kind of entrepreneurial figure, the the capitalistic adventurer has existed all over the world. With the exception of trade and credit and banking activities, the basic opportunities sought by such men have been either in purely irrational speculation or an acquisition by violence, and above all an acquisition of booty, either in an actual war or by the fiscal plunder of subject peoples over a long period." End quote. Max Weber. Footnote. According to Mueller, quote, "Capitalism meant something very specific to Weber, the organization of formally free labor in the methodical, rational, and disciplined work," end quote. While the more sweeping definitions we have quoted above seem to indicate that Weber was not so consistent about adhering to this labor-based definition of capitalism, as with the broader definition, this more specific definition is still a kind of, quote, "ideal type," end quote, that could be applied to many different societies in different time periods. End of footnote. If the unifying definition of capitalism is reduced to, quote, "acquisitive activity," end quote, rendering it ahistorical and universal, the term is emptied of its specificity. In the case of ancient Rome, Weber was at least more specific. Ager publicus was for Weber the pristine form of communal agrarian property that the Romans inherited when the Romans began. But the key development of the Romans was ager privitas, private property in land, that came to involve a business-like form of organization based on the pursuit of profits, so uninhibited that he even recognized it as, quote, "an agrarian capitalism," end quote. In the present work, we are discussing an entirely distinct conception of, quote, "agrarian capitalism," end quote, set in early modern England. So, as not to invite confusion, let us make it clear that Weber's conception of an ancient agrarian capitalism is not a system of agriculture driven by market forces and market imperatives, but is rather of one that still involves the application of, quote, "extra economic," end quote, or coercive political force. How do we know this? Because Weber drew a distinction between modern and earlier forms of capitalism. Notwithstanding Weber's sweeping definition of capitalism, Weber did see something unique and distinct about what he called, quote, "modern rational capitalism," end quote, or, quote, "market capitalism," end quote. Quote, "The West," end quote, writes Weber, quote, "has given capitalism a degree of significance such as it has never had elsewhere," end quote. For in the modern West, quote, "there exists a completely different form of capitalism which has developed nowhere else in the world, the rational capitalist organization of formerly free labor," end quote, Weber. It bears asking here of what utility is it to work with two contradictory definitions of capitalism. In reviewing Weber's agrarian sociology of ancient civilizations, John Love takes note of this dual definition. Initially, Weber offers the following definition, quote, "Where we find that property is an object of trade and is utilized by individuals for profit-making in a market economy, there we have capitalism," end quote. But later in the same work, Weber distinguishes, quote, "political capitalism," end quote, as a mode of profit-making involving the application of force from, quote, "market capitalism," end quote, or, quote, "bourgeois capitalism," end quote, involving acquisition of peaceful methods. Love finds this distinction useful because it, quote, "it assists in explaining those acquisitive activities that possess capitalistic features without identifying the ancient forms with modern capitalism," end quote. But this is only to restate the problem. Even if Love wishes to shy away from Weber's claim that capitalism existed in the ancient world, he still suggests that, quote, "capitalistic features," end quote, were present. What made certain features of ancient society, quote, "capitalistic," end quote? Either Love is measuring ancient society against the measure of, quote, "modern capitalism," end quote, to anachronistically label features of ancient society as, quote, "capitalistic," end quote, or like Weber, he defines what is, quote, "capitalistic," end quote, so broadly that it could be applied to virtually any society. One second. Father needs his coffee. Man, first sip of coffee of the day. That hit right, yo. It's fucking dank. For our purposes, we recognize profit-making and the acquisition of large-scale wealth in ancient society as a form of private property based on, quote, extra-economic, end quote, methods of surplus extraction. Weber appears to recognize this distinction when he writes that ancient capitalism, quote, was rooted in politics. That is, it depended on the private exploitation of relationships of private domination in an expanded city-state, end quote. Here lies the rub, for it is precisely the, quote, extra-economic, end quote, character of ancient property that distinguishes pre-capitalist forms of property, and it is precisely the, quote, strictly economic, end quote, character of property governed by market imperatives that distinguishes the form of private property found under conditions of modern capitalism. As such, ancient society was a form of European class society involving large-scale private property, but it was not in any meaningful sense capitalist. As Ellen Mason's Wood explains, the Romans developed, quote, a conception of property more individualistic and exclusive than ever before, end quote. But, quote, Rome was not a capitalist society, nor a, quote, liberal democracy, end quote. It is certainly true that unlike any other ancient civilization, the Romans created a regime with two distinct poles of power in which a well-developed central state coexisted with strong private property, and it is no doubt also true that, as the imperial state grew, there were tensions between propertied classes and an increasingly burdensome state. But there never existed in Rome a system of appropriation, like capitalism, which depended on extensive growth, rooted in profitability, competitive production, rather than on the extensive growth of property in a massive grab for land. Territorial expansion in the empire was an extension of land concentrated at home and public power of the state. Its coercive force played a more immediate role in the acquisition of private wealth, end quote. Wood. By clarifying the distinction between an economic system based on well-defined rights of property, but still rooted in various forms of extra-economic surplus extraction, and an economic system in which the economic sphere is, quote, insulated, end quote, from extra-economic, quote, interference, end quote, so that market regulation becomes paramount, Wood avoids reduplicating Weber's confusing dual definition of capitalism without failing to acknowledge the contribution which the development of strong private property in the ancient world made to the subsequent development of feudalism, absolutism, and capitalism. Neil Evans makes an argument similar to Weber's with regard to mining in claiming that the mining region around Newcastle in the northeast of England was, quote, capitalist, end quote, from early on. Evans gives two reasons to justify his claim. First, Evans notes that Newcastle enjoyed international trading links from as early as 1500 or before. Quote, Danzig and the Netherlands were important trading partners, end quote. Footnote. Quote, Evans writes, quote, The region illustrates the dominance of what Thompson calls an agrarian bourgeoisie, end quote. Evans notes that, quote, the phrase is implied rather than used directly, end quote. However, a checking of both hardback and paper versions of Thompson's book reveals nothing remotely connected to this suggestion. End footnote. Here, Evans resonates with Weber in equating capitalism with trade and with the commercialization model, or any theory ascribing the rise of capitalism to the rise of trade in the early modern period. Second, however, Evans notes that from the early 1600s, relations between landlords and tenants had already become contractual. Mining, claims Evans, attracted laborers who were effectively proletarian from early on. Quote, the coal industry from an early stage developed a detailed division of labor and a proletariat recruited from the wandering poor, criminals and civil prisoners. Many came from Scotland, and the whole workforce was given none of the status accorded to people who worked the land or to craftsmen. No guild organization ever emerged in coal mining. The product was seen as being offensive, and the people carried its tape. End quote. Evans. As menial jobs with low wages, these would have been the jobs that men in the, quote, honorable trades, end quote, eschewed. It does appear, therefore, that English mining operations involved the employment of proletarian or semi-proletarian laborers. By attracting these displaced souls who had little else available to them as a means of making a living, mining operations played the role of absorbing a portion of the displaced population without access to the means of subsistence, whose numbers had been increasing in England since at least the 16th century. It may well be that many European miners from the 13th to the 17th centuries became dependent upon the market for earning wages and spending those wages to acquire the necessities of life. But there is nothing inherently capitalist about the practice of wage labor as such, as wage labor had existed in many pre-capitalist societies. If these early mining operations were indeed capitalist, we would expect to find evidence that they operated according to a logic of price competition in a marketplace generally free of extra economic forms of market regulation, between employers who are themselves not only dependent upon market exchange for access to labor and the realization of profits, but also subject to a market imperative to transform production by making it more efficient and cost-effective in order to ensure their economic survival. Nevertheless, what the available evidence suggests about these early mining operations is that rather than being driven by market imperatives, the relations of production continued to be regulated by extra economic forms. While the workers mostly retained direct customary control over the labor process and therefore over the means of production, the employers were effectively merchants enjoying monopoly rights over their mines, which freed them from competitive pressures that might otherwise have led to their seizing direct control of the over the labor process in order to transform production. Mining and Agrarian Capitalism, the instructive case of Wickham. Wickham. If one accepts the seemingly counterintuitive suggestion that it was a transformation in agrarian class relations that formed the crucial rupture that enabled the development of a distinctly, quote, economic, end quote, sphere of social relations in which production could be regulated directly by the market and thereby became subject to the pressures of market competition, making the transformation of production an imperative, what then of manufacturing in England during the period of so-called agrarian capitalism? To address this question, we continue our discussion of proletarianization in capitalism in mining by way of considering Levine and Wrightson's case study of the growth of mining in the manor of Wickham. Wickham was a manor in the Tyneside with large coal deposits, making it destined to become one of the principal coal mining sites around Newcastle. Quote, from the later 16th century, it had witnessed the emergence of industrial undertakings of striking scale and complex organization, of, quote, specialized and distinctively industrial settlements, end quote, and a hitherto unknown concentration of industrial workers. Coal mining also attracted other industries to the area, quote, salt, glass, and lime, shipbuilding, copper, and iron, end quote. It was here in 1961 that Sir Ambrose Crowley would establish his mighty Winlaton ironworks that would soon become one of the largest manufacturing complexes of the early 18th century. In the late 16th century, a grand lease had been awarded to the local landlords, allowing for mining on the open fields. The award led directly to a dispute between two factions. On the one side were the, quote, inns, end quote, or the, quote, grand lessees, end quote, most of whom belonged to the company of hostmen, admission to which was generally restricted to those owning or leasing coal mines. On the other side were the, quote, outs, end quote, who called themselves the, quote, non-grand lessees, end quote. and were comprised mainly of, quote, smaller coal owners whose interests were ignored by the ruling faction, end quote. Footnote. Sweezy writes, quote, the circumstances surrounding the origin of the Grand Lease are somewhat mysterious, but it seems clear that in the year 1582 a certain Thomas Sutton, acting on behalf of the Crown, obtained from the Bishop of Durham a lease running for 99 years on all his coal lands in the manors of Wickham and Gateshead, end quote. Sutton subsequently sold the lease to two of the wealthiest merchants in Newcastle on the promise that they turn over the lease to the mayor and burgesses of Newcastle, but instead they opened it up to private interests. End footnote. The quote, the interloping, quote, outs, end quote, soon complained that the lessees had used their monopoly position in order to raise the price of coal from 4 shillings to 9 shillings per cauldron, taking their complaint to the Bishop of Durham and to London. At stake was not so much the question of monopoly as such, but control over the municipal government itself, by which control over mining operations could be assured through the exercise of patronage and extra economic power. The matter was settled in favor of the Grand Lessees in the form of a new charter for Newcastle, granted in 1600, which guaranteed the control of the municipal government to the, quote, inns, end quote, and provided for the incorporation of the Company of Hostmen. What did Queen Elizabeth get in return? First, a steady supply of coal for the rapidly expanding city of London was guaranteed. Second, an increase on the tax on coal was agreed upon, raising it from 4p to 1 shilling per cauldron. It was a historic bargain, and one which allowed for the further growth of centralized mining operations. Wickham was still enclosed in 1600, and pastoral agriculture was predominant, while the mining activities that took place in the late 16th century did little to disrupt the way of life of local producers. This was in part due to the fact that copyholders were vigorous about protecting their rights. By 1610, a suit by the copyholders of Wickham and a countersuit by the Grand Lessees both found their way to court. The documents were guaranteed as they proceeded to show, the documents were generated as they proceeded the documents that were generated as they proceeded showed the lines of conflict very clearly drawn. The copyholders complained bitterly over their recent usage at the hands of the general lessees, expressing themselves roundly in submissions and testimony, crackling with resentment and indignation. Anticipating the struggle of English textile workers in the late 18th century, the peasants emphasized that the rights to the land that they enjoyed were rooted in custom. They complained that their fields were being entered upon and mined without their consent. And they, quote, challenged the coal owners' right to proceed, quote, at their pleasure, end quote, for they explicitly accused them of arrogating to themselves an extra-legal absolute power, end quote. Levine and Wrightson. Absolute it may have been, but it was not extra-legal. The Grand Lease was no doubt a royal concession, and as such had the status of common law. Footnote. Levine and Wrightson cite a lecture by E.P. Thompson given in 1986 in which Thompson advised that it is, quote, unwise to posit too sharp a distinction between law and custom, end quote. In other writings, Thompson pointed out that custom often enjoyed the status of law, while the Grand Lease was not extra-legal. Neither were the efforts of the peasants to defend their rights by appealing to custom. We have two legal systems in conflict here. End footnote. The imposition of mining rights on land still held in common under the law of the manor inevitably created a situation characterized by a state of friction between two parties. The court case did lead to an attempt to a settlement in 1621. To meet the grievances of the copy holders, they were to be consulted on roadways and recompensed for damages. Quote, they were also to receive fire coal for their homes at a price of 1 pence per bowl. End quote. Levine and Wrightson. Wasted pits were to be filled, and so on, but the copy holders were ordered not to hinder the mining and carriage of coal by the grand lessees. Quote, they were forbidden to enter into any, quote, agreement or combination among themselves not to lead but at such and such rates as themselves shall agree, end quote. And if they and the lessees could not agree, the commission was to set wage rates, end quote. Thus the copyholder did not come away empty-handed, but, quote, on all essentials they had lost, end quote. Footnote. Levine and Wrightson write, quote, in effect, the decision of 1621 meant that the fate of copyholders of Wickham was sealed, end quote. An instructive exception was the case of Robert Harding, a freeholder who claimed that his land was not affected by the decision of 1621 because it was a freehold of the neighboring Hollinside Manor and not part of Wickham. After 4 years in court, Harding was awarded damages of £720 for the coal that had been removed and £500 for the resultant decline in the value of his property. As a freeholder, Harding would have been able to make his case at common law, and we can only speculate that this was the true reason for his success. That is, his ability to assert absolute legal title to his land in the king's court. Were he a copyholder, his case would have involved a boundary issue between two adjoining manors, in either of which his tenure would have remained insecure at best. End footnote. As mining on the open field proceeded apace, Wickham was not depopulated but grew in population, thanks in large part to the fact that mining operations were now attracting outsiders looking for employment in mining as well as in a local agriculture that was responding to rising prices driven by the increasing demand for agricultural produce to feed the growing number of people employed in mining and other industries. This demand for greater agricultural output was a major factor in the later decision to enclose the parish in 1678. Enclosure in Wickham had social consequences that are more familiar to us through the examples of late 18th century parliamentary enclosure, accelerated social polarization, mounting poor law rates to deal with the growing numbers of the poor, and by 1750 the establishment of a workhouse at Solwell. The case of Wickham is instructive because it serves as an example of the conversion of tenancies to economic leaseholds and the subsequent enclosure of the parish being undertaken for purposes other than agrarian ones. Here we have a case of peasants appealing to customary manorial law in their legal struggle to preserve their customary rights against the claim of the holders of an economic lease, not for purposes of tenant farming or putting up a sheep run, but for, quote, industrial, end quote, mining operations. In his study of the rise of the British coal industry, John Neff recognizes how such conversions to economic leaseholds and subsequent enclosures of land for purposes of coal mining contributed to the distinctly English path of economic development. Neff writes that, quote, only a curtailment of the mineral rights claimed by the manorial tenants could have made the private ownership of royalties tolerable. Wherever collieries were started, we find a movement to prevent the peasants from working coal, or hindering the lord of the manor or his concessionaire from working it, in both their own hands and the manorial waste. Portions of the waste which contained coal were often enclosed in order to facilitate mining. It is not unlikely that some lords ejected tenants because of their potential claims to share in the revenue arising from the working of coal. The growth in rural districts of other industries encouraged by the expansion of coal mining also interfered with the rights of small tenants. Coal was therefore a factor of some importance in the decline of peasant proprietorship and the increase of the large estate, together with sheep farming and the confiscation of property of the religious foundations. Coal mining helps to account for the differences between the agrarian history of England and the agrarian history of the continent." End quote. Neff. This is a remarkable observation coming from the same scholar who proposed, quote, "an early industrial revolution," end quote, marked by the rise of large centralized manufacturing operations in 16th and 17th century England. We are not aware of Neff having drawn any causal connections between the, quote, "agrarian history of England," end quote, and the emergence of these larger manufacturing units. What we do know is that in this view, coal mining profoundly shaped the course of English history. Quote, "The rise of the coal industry during the Stuart period," quote, "the rise of the coal industry during the Stuart period," end quote, he writes, quote, "helped to establish parliamentary government. It is not too much to say that the general economic and social development of the period from 1550 to 1700 cannot be understood unless account is taken of the part played in it by the coal industry," end quote. Neff. While attributing major political developments to the conversion to a new source of power smacks of economism in the extreme, this is not to say that the unprecedented expansion of coal use played anything less than a critical role in the development of capitalism in England. It did. England became the first nation to convert from reliance upon, quote, "current local sunlight," end quote, as an energy source to what we now commonly refer to as, quote, "fossil fuels," end quote. Footnote. Hartman contrasts the use of, quote, "current direct sunlight," end quote, with the use of, quote, "ancient sunlight," end quote, in other words, so-called fossil fuels. Another footnote. There is apparently some disagreement with the prevailing view that so-called fossil fuels are actually derived from ancient plant and animal life. Quote, "ancient sunlight," end quote, see previous footnote, or whether oil is in fact a, quote, "primordial," end quote, geologic material. For a discussion, see Engdahl, 2004. End of footnote. This marks a pivotal moment in human history. In addition to the advantages of allowing for new techniques of production to be devised or freeing up English timber for other uses, coal offered clear advantages over water and wood. Ellen Mason's wood, This marks a pivotal moment in human history. In addition to these, the advantages of allowing for new techniques of production to be devised or freeing up English timber for other uses, coal offered clear advantages over water and wood. Wood, quote, "with its greater bulk for caloric value and less readily controllable heat, was a poorer basis for many industrial processes," end quote. Black. Coal was readily transportable and more controllable. It could be mined and burned year-round, whereas water wheels were subject to ice flows, floods, and decreases in water flow. Ultimately, the conversion to coal and away from wood and muscle as sources of power allowed for the release from dependence on fixed power sources, such as water and wind in the form of the steam engine, and later, with the discovery of the potential of oil as a fuel source, the internal combustion engine, with such long-term ramifications of global warming resulting from the release of greenhouse gases and mercury poisoning in the fish supply due to the exhaust from the coal-fired power plants. As far-reaching as the implications of this shift away from, quote, "ancient direct sunlight," end quote, may have been in terms of making possible new ways of applying energy to production, however, this development was ancillary to the transformation of class and property relations involved in the emergence of agrarian capitalism, understood as a transitional stage leading to the transformation of agrarian and subsequently industrial production in ways that would necessitate innovations in energy production and usage. Additionally, by increasing agrarian productivity and thereby lowering the price of agricultural goods, agrarian capitalism could act as the primary stimulus to the unique and unprecedented expansion of the domestic market in England, a development in which the growth of London played a central role. The growth of the domestic market and population translated into increasing demand for manufactures. In turn, the expanding demand for fuel in both manufacturing and for domestic use in expanding urban centers put increasing pressure on supplies of timber, encouraging the conversion to coal use. Thus, it could be argued that it was the economic compulsions of developing agrarian capitalism which led to the drive to expand coal production, while the expansion of coal use, in turn, expanded the limits of what was possible in terms of both, quote, improving, end quote, or innovating in production and the growth of urban populations. What the case of Wickham demonstrates is that the imposition of common law property rights in land in favor of operations employing both waged and casual laborers, where the profits accrued to the owner or leaseholder, not only took place outside the agriculture, quote, sector, end quote, but during the same time period as the development of agrarian capitalism. It also demonstrates that whether for agrarian or, quote, industrial, end quote, purposes, the curtailment of the rights of customary tenants in favor of the rights of the holders of economic leases, or the wholesale extinguishing of the customary law upon the enclosure of the manor, had similar consequences, namely the divorcing of direct peasant producers from the means of production and contributing to the growth of a proletarian labor force. If mining is taken as an industrial as opposed to agrarian form of production, does it still make sense then to think of this period in terms of the development of agrarian capitalism in early modern England, as a productive activity vastly in the minority next to agriculture and husbandry? Coal mining may have transformed the regional landscape and the regional economy of such sub-regions as that of Tyneside, but it is difficult to see how coal mining did more than contribute to the development of agrarian capitalism, being one highly significant line of manufacture in a society still dominated by agrarian production. They're doing some road work on the street, so this portion might be of the recording might be a little rough. But what are you gonna do? Gotta fix the street. I don't even know if they're actually fixing the street. They might be doing sewer work. I don't fucking know. I should ask them. What the hell are you guys doing? It's my street. King of this street. The so-called phase of proto-industrialization. Although the term, quote, proto-industrialization has been used before, Franklin Mendel's, writing in 1972, was the first to use the term systematically. Footnote. Gullickson comments, quote, in 1972, Franklin Mendel's introduced the term proto-industrialization into the vocabulary of economic and social historians. The term had been used before, most notably by E.J.T. Collins, E.L. Jones, J. Wolfe, in analyzing advances in European agriculture, but it had no systematic usage. End quote. Peter Kreidta and Hans Medic later offered a neo-Marxist approach to the theory. They saw proto-industrialization as the second in a three-phase process, the first being the growth of domestic manufacturing, not tied to international markets, the third being factory mechanization. As one commentator has noted, the greatest contribution of the term, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote, may be that it has generated such a range of studies on the same generalized phenomenon in a wide variety of contexts. At the same time, however, criticism of the theory in both its origins, Mendel's, and neo-Marxists, Ch.1 and Medic variants, by authors both sympathetic, Ogilvy, and hostile, Coleman, Houston, and Snell, has exposed the theory's lack of solid foundation. In the previous section, we discussed the development of centralized industrial production in England from the Tudor era onwards, yet proto-industrialization theory tends to ignore these developments. Coleman comments that, quote, if the purpose of the theory is to shed light on the way in which industrialization came about, it is surely necessary to look at other sorts of industrial activities and at urban manufacturing as well as rural, in order to see if they conduced to, or, equally important, failed to conduce to industrialization proper. End quote. Coleman. What Neff's argument and proto-industrialization theory have in common is that both suggest a, quote, stage, end quote, of development within a larger process of historical evolution. As such, the same problem or question applies to both theories. What is the process at work behind the rise of larger centralized firms in the 16th and 17th centuries, or the expansion of rural manufacturing throughout the early modern period? The most striking inconsistency to be found in proto-industrialization as a stage theory is that in some regions proto-industry is seen to have led to industrial revolution, while in other regions proto-industry led to, quote, deindustrialization, end quote. This robs the theory of the potential for having any intellectual rigor, quote, especially since the factors which decided whether a proto-industrial region would industrialize or deindustrialize remain largely unclear, end quote. What we can say for certain is that various forms of rural domestic manufacturing expanded significantly from the 16th and 17th centuries in regions scattered across Europe. Some of those regions later underwent full-scale industrialization, others saw rural manufactures decline and return to agricultural predominance. But the move from Phase 2 to Phase 3 to full industrialization did not take place all at once. Significantly, Mendel sees proto-industrialization on the continent as delayed and is primarily a response to English proto-industrialization. Likewise, Ch.1 writes that industrialization on the continent, quote, was primarily a response to the English challenge, end quote. But if proto-industrialization was an intermediate phase between the post-feudal domestic system and fully fledged industrialization, why should its development and the subsequent process of full industrialization on the continent be delayed, and why should these processes be dependent upon English developments? In England, rural domestic and putting out manufacture linked to overseas markets grew up alongside the guild system, experiencing periods of expansion and contraction, quote, over 6 successive centuries, end quote. Periods of economic expansion saw peasants taking advantage of market opportunities by producing goods for the market in their cottages, especially during the winter months. As we noted above, by the 16th century, the development of rural handicraft production in England was concentrated in spinning and weaving. By constructing, quote, putting out, end quote, arrangements in the countryside, urban merchants could circumvent company restrictions limiting the number of employees they could put to work, thus contributing to the exceptional expansion of rural manufacturing in the English countryside. Hudson finds it surprising that the bulk of the theory on proto-industrialization has focused on continental Europe, even the fact that England led the way in the transition to an industrial society. Quote, if any environment were to provide a test case for various hypotheses derived from the work of Mendel's and others, it was likely to be England. Not only did several proto-industrial regions later become the heartlands of a more fully fledged urban industrial society, but they did so without competition from earlier mechanized and transformed industries in other parts of Europe. In addition, the social structure, the expansion of markets, and the framework of law and taxation in England were such as to provide every encouragement to the unfettered expansion of commercial, manufacturing, proletarianization, and wealth accumulation, compared with social and institutional environments in many areas of continental Europe." End quote. While the English case may, the quote was Hudson. While the English case may seem like the ideal case for exploring so-called, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote, it actually poses enormous problems for proto-industrialization theory, for when looking at rural manufacturing in England, one quickly finds that there is no single pattern of transition from rural manufacturing to industrialization proper, criticizing the argument put forward by Ch.1 et al. That the putting out system, Verlag system, involved greater concentration and control of capital accumulation than the domestic system, Kaufsystem, or Kaufsystem. Randall writes, quote, "The theory of proto-industrialization assumes that Verlag systems were more adaptable to transition to the factory than were the more, quote, backward, end quote, Kaufsystems. English woolen industry does not bear this out. In fact, the opposite is correct. Just as the domestic system had proved itself adaptable to rapid growth in the 18th century, with the onset of mechanization, it was able to absorb much of the new technology within the existing structure and advance still faster," end quote. According to Hudson, Randall. According to Hudson, English proto-industrialization involved a variety of household structures with no simple linear development. The location of, quote, proto-industries, end quote, in England has been associated with such variables as the type of soil, pastoralism, seasonality of agriculture, fragmentation of holdings, weak manorialism, and access to common rights. Coleman identifies 10 areas of England where the theory identifies proto-industrialization and finds that only 4 of these industrialized, the others leading to de-industrialization. Quote, "The obvious difference which separates the 4, end quote, he claims, was their proximity to coal fields. Moreover," notes Coleman, "Northeast and South Wales had little or no rural manufacturing, and yet these regions took part in the early Industrial Revolution. Clearly, the development of rural manufacturing was not a necessary phase for a region to undergo in order to arrive at industrialization. At the same time, proximity to coal did not ensure a successful transition or, quote, proto, end quote, or full industrialization, as Hudson points out, writing, quote, "The eclipse of the Kentish Weald, East Anglia, the West Country, and several other proto-industrial regions occurred before coal became a vital locational influence," end quote. There is little doubt that more proximate causal factors such as geography and institutional arrangements at the village level were important factors in determining where rural manufacturing appeared, the types of trades that were adopted and in what form. But Coleman finds such heterogeneity in the various locations where rural manufacturing were found that he questions whether it is even possible to define the regions in England where, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote, developed. He proceeds to question whether enclosures were perhaps more significant than poor soils and weak agricultural incomes in prompting rural dwellers to seek additional income in industrial by-employments, a suggestion relevant to our discussion. Coleman. Ch.1 et al. Specify that, quote, there's no quote. Why am I saying that? Ch.1 et al. Specify that what they refer to as, quote, the general framework of capitalist industrialization, end quote, was a necessary condition for proto-industrialization to lead to full industrialization. Note that this, quote, general framework of capitalist industrialization, end quote, is not explained in the theory, but is simply taken for granted. Such an assumption, writes Coleman, quote, puts proto-industrialization itself in a wholly indeterminate position, leaving us unable to tell how much was caused by proto-industrialization and how much by all the other things comprehended within the quote general framework, end quote. We are back with the familiar collection of possible causes stigmatized by new economic historians as the quote shopping list, end quote. Coleman. Oh, quote shopping list, end quote, end of the larger quote. Coleman. A quote within a quote. Okay. As is perhaps to be expected of any concept around which a theory develops, the theorists of proto-industrialization go in search of the causes of the phenomenon of so-called proto-industrialization, but can only resort to caveats when the core concept of the theory itself is challenged or beset by problems. The quote shopping list, end quote, of proximate causes in proto-industrial theory also includes enclosures. Below, we will argue that the full significance of enclosures can only be understood as part of a long-term historical process, specifically one involving the transformation of property rights. In fact, any discussion of a general framework of social relations would be incomplete without a discussion of class and property relations. Therefore, since the general structure of capitalist social relations is a necessary condition for the successful transition from cottage manufacturing to factory industrialization, explaining how cottage and putting out, quote, proto-industrial, end quote, manufacturing contributed to the Industrial Revolution would require a theory to explain the origin of capitalist property relations, a topic about which proto-industrialization theory has very little to say. It's getting real gnarly now. Well, hopefully the microphone doesn't pick up things that are a million miles away. Well, I think it doesn't. I think it's actually way louder for me than it is for the microphone. So, hopefully you can still hear me despite the factory that is encircling my house. Anyway. Therefore, since the general structure of capitalist social relations is a necessary condition for the successful transition from cottage manufacturing to factory industrialization, explaining how cottage and putting out, quote, proto-industrial, end quote, manufacturing contributed to the Industrial Revolution would require a theory to explain the origin of capitalist property relations, a topic about which proto-industrialization theory has very little to say. The theory is caught up in a tautology, what is used to explain how domestic manufacturing forms, in some instances, a causal link between earlier forms of manufacturing and industrial industry is nothing other than the quote, general structure, end quote, of capitalist industry itself. Creedta writes, quote, proto-industrialization stands between two worlds, the nearer world of the village and the world of trade that crosses all boundaries between the agrarian economy and merchant capitalism, end quote. Footnote. It is worth noting that the three authors of that volume are not in agreement on the nature of proto-industrialization. Creedta and Medic see proto-industrialization as a separate economic system, while Schlumbaum views it as part of the feudal system. End footnote. Thus, for Creedta, trade is the dynamic capitalist element, acting upon the stagnant feudal agrarian sector. Here we see the Neo-Smithian conceptualization of the problem at work. Brenner. Trade, which is assumed to be inherently capitalist, liberates, quote, proto-industry, end quote, from proto-industry's backward and presumably feudal, quote, fetters, end quote, allowing proto-industry to naturally develop into full-scale factory industrialization. A discussion of the origin of capitalist class relations is at best a subject for further inquiry, and at worst is left out of the inquiry altogether. The theory is perhaps most vague about precisely when the so-called phase of proto-industrialization begins. Indeed, the writing in Ch.1, Medic, and Schlumbaum, Industrialization Before Industrialization, a book, is so abstracted from specific historical events that it seems to reify a timeless, quote, proto-industrial household, end quote, at the expense of bearing in mind the transitional character of this form, or of doing justice to the heterogeneity of rural handicraft arrangements. With no clearly defined historical period for the onset of the proto-industrial phase, and with the outcome of the phase being either industrialization or deindustrialization of the region in question, a truism, it becomes very hard to see how the various appearances and disappearances of rural manufacturing cohere into a distinct, quote, phase, end quote, at all. In theory, then, proto-industrialization also stands, quote, between two worlds, end quote, in a larger historical and temporal sense, that is, between feudalism and capitalism. Mendel's argued that as it developed, proto-industrialization broke down the general institutional framework of feudal agrarian society and developed a new framework of markets. Ch.1, Medic, and Schlumbaum make a similar claim when they write that, quote, viewed from the long-range perspective, proto-industrialization belongs to the great process of transformation, which seized the feudal European agrarian societies and led them towards industrial capitalism. On closer inspection, however, it becomes clear that proto-industrialization could establish itself only where the ties of the feudal system had either loosened or were in the process of full disintegration, end quote. Ch.1, Medic, and Schlumbaum. This thesis is empirically false. By contrast to Western Europe, Eastern Europe experienced a, quote, second serfdom, end quote, and yet cottage manufacturing still developed in the context of, quote, strong, end quote, feudal institutions. In Bohemia, lords urged and sometimes compelled their peasants to engage in by-employments in manufacturing and could keep costs low, quote, through, quote, forced wage labor, end quote, exploitation of labor services for, quote, proto-industrial, end quote, auxiliary tasks, and restricting peasants' alternative options, end quote. Footnote. The extent, if any, of, quote, putting out, end quote, arrangements in Bohemia is uncertain, underlying the exploitation of Bohemian peasants by forcing them into a situation of wage labor was a doubling of the population in the century before 1750, creating a surplus of labor, more than could be put to work on the land. The labor costs were low, but they were artificially pushed lower by heavy feudal burdens. By Klima's account, industrial by-employments do not appear to have played a, quote, corrosive, end quote, role on feudal relations. End of footnote. In England, the Low Countries, Switzerland, and the Rhine, on the other hand, village communities and the traditional institutions of regulating access to land were already weakened prior to the development of significant, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote. Ogilvy suggests that, quote, what mattered for proto-industry was not so much the, quote, strengthening, end quote, or, quote, weakening, end quote, of feudalism, but the specific effect of feudal institutions on industrial costs, end quote. In general, there is significant disagreement about to which areas of Europe the theory of proto-industrialization actually does or does not apply. Houston and Snell find, quote, that the heuristic value of the theory seems to be limited to northwestern Europe, end quote. Houston and Snell. At the same time, however, they find with Coleman that the demographic predictions of the theory do not bear out for England. Some German scholars have insisted that Germany followed a, quote, special path, end quote, to industrialization, and that the theory is not applicable to German conditions. Ogilvy and Ch. Kerman. In considering the case of the Pays de Caux in France, Gullikson finds the thesis that, quote, proto-industrialization, end quote, developed only in areas not suitable for surplus cereal production is not tenable. As Houston and Snell write, quote, problems abound, end quote. Footnote. Gullikson writes, quote, the proto-industrialization of the Pays de Caux, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Paysdecaux, pose problems for the usual models of proto-industrialization in acute form. The expansion of the cottage textile industry in the fertile and well-formed Caux demonstrates that large-scale cottage industry could and did spread in regions of commercial cereal agriculture, as well as in regions of subsistence agriculture, and suggests that seasonal unemployment and landlessness, not subsistence agriculture, were the distinguishing features of proto-industrial regions, end quote. End of footnote. It is enough trouble that one of the central premises of proto-industrialization theory, that proto-industrialization is corrosive to feudal social relations, can be disproved by the evidence. But the larger issue is that the theory seeks to encompass far more than the theory can bear. It is not only that the primary attention given to rural manufacturing, at the expense of urban handicrafts and more centralized manufacturing operations, is unwarranted for a theory seeking to explain the transition to industrial revolution. It is also that proto-industrialization theory, in proto-industrialization theory's original formulations, sought to explain both the decline of feudal institutions and the onset of industrialization in one go. What is at issue is the underlying assumption that these two processes are one and the same. What is behind this assumption? Creedta writes, quote, then, as the social division of labor deepened and became the agent of the economic process, it ceased to be purely the division of labor between town and countryside. In fact, the division of labor between town and countryside, where it was upheld, increasingly turned into an obstacle to further development of the forces of production. Economic growth could throw off its fetters only if the self-sufficient peasant production unit could be cracked open, end quote. Creedta, Medic, Schlumbaum. Excuse me. Burpsy. Once the, quote, fetters, end quote, to capitalist economic development are removed, so the assumption goes, economic growth is no longer inhibited. So it already exists in embryo, waiting to be liberated. But what if feudal social relations in Western Europe declined without immediately producing capitalism? What if capitalism did not simply exist, quote, in embryo, end quote, within the womb of feudalism, but had to be realized as a new form of social relations? The problem is that capitalism's emergence into history is not explained. Capitalism is simply assumed to already exist. The, quote, phase, end quote, or, quote, stage, end quote, of proto-industrialization is the transitional link between two ideal types of society, or two vastly generalized modes of production. But whether we fill in the gap with rural domestic manufacturing or urban centralized manufacturing, or by theorizing a, quote, articulation, end quote, of modes of production, there remains the work of explaining the logic of the process of change itself. It is not difficult to see why rural cottage manufacturing could be construed as the, quote, link, end quote, between an agrarian feudalism and urbanized industrial society. Since rural cottage manufacturing combines so many elements of both agrarian feudalism and urbanized industrial society, manufacturing in an agrarian setting, urban merchants setting to work rural dwellers, and all this happening in many locations that would later witness industrialization. Creedta claims that proto-industrialization, quote, did indeed provide certain conditions for a capitalistic industrialization, end quote, yet admits that these conditions, quote, were not, however, sufficient to actually introduce the process of industrialization, end quote. Footnote. Checking his dictionary, Coleman writes, quote, according to the OED, the prefix proto, derived from the Greeks, means first in time, earliest, original, primitive, or less commonly, first in rank or importance, chief or principal. Proto-industrialization, as defined in the theory, has no claim to conform to either of these definitions, especially to the more common meaning of being the earliest or original form of something. End quote. Hey! Get out of here! Cat in the yard better not be fucking with my bunnies. End of footnote. One second. Goddamn cats. Wouldn't mind a cat, but they're bad for the other animals. The concept of proto-industrialization has come to be applied not only broadly across the map of Europe, but outside of Europe. Various studies suggest the presence of, quote, proto-industrialization in India. In justifying this application of the term to Minas Gerais, a Brazilian, quote, slave society, end quote, Douglas Cole Libby explains that because the model of proto-industrialization has been challenged to account for examples that resulted not in industrialization but deindustrialization, quote, proto-industrialization is no longer exclusively viewed as a preparatory phase in the quote, proto-industrialization is no longer exclusively viewed as a preparatory phase in the industrialization process. The practical result of the critical revision of the proto-industrial model has been a broadening of the concept, which tends to allow for the inclusion of a much wider range of observable historical phenomenon within what might be labeled as proto-industrial phases or tendencies, end quote. Libby defines proto-industrialization as, quote, wide-scale rural production of industrial goods destined for distant markets and based on low-cost peasant labor, end quote. Libby. Given such a definition, the question arises, if such peasant production is no longer a preparatory phase anticipating industrialization, why is it necessary to utilize the, quote, proto, end quote, prefix at all, even if the term is to be stripped of whatever geographic or historical specificity it may have once carried? The etymological implication of something that is indeed a preparatory, quote, proto, end quote, phase anticipating industrialization remains. How, then, can the application of the term to any type of situation involving rural or peasant manufactures, whether or not it preceded industrialization, be justified? And how is that better than simply calling it something like, quote, peasant-based manufacturing, end quote, or, quote, commercialized rural manufactures, end quote? In spite of the persistent rejection of the usage of the term by many social scientists, there are those who still call for a continuation or revival of the term's usage. Describing proto-industrialization as more of a, quote, research strategy, end quote, than a, quote, historical period, end quote, Julie Marfani argues that those who believe that the theory is disproved by the failure of proto-industrial regions to industrialize are viewing a theory that was simply intended as a, quote, point of departure, end quote, in, quote, excessively rigid terms, end quote. It is, quote, undeniable, end quote, writes Marfani, quote, that many areas of Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries witnessed the rise of a new form of industrial production for non-local markets, production that usually remained rural and domestic in nature and was practiced alongside agriculture. The distinctive nature of proto-industry demands recognition as a particular area for research, end quote. Marfanny. We're on the home stretch, team. Yet the extent research that proceeded upon the assumptions of the founders of the theory and found them to be false is thereby called into question the, quote, distinctive nature, end quote, of so-called, quote, proto-industry, end quote. There is nothing controversial about calling for comparative studies of rural, commercially oriented manufacturing across different parts of Europe or even around the globe, but it is hard to see how insisting upon the usage of a term laden with the baggage of disproven theses will serve to do more than perpetuate the confusion. Footnote. Marfanny's study of the village of Igualada in Catalan is significant for a reason having nothing to do with the theory of proto-industrialization. Brenner, who pioneered the theory of English agrarian capitalism, views Catalonia as one of only two regions outside of England where agrarian capitalism, as Brenner understands agrarian capitalism, may have developed, the other being Holland. Marfanny acknowledges that, quote, Catalonia is a, quote, success, end quote, story in the proto-industry, in that proto-industry was followed by factory industry, end quote. The question arises, to what extent did agrarian capitalism, or some process very much like agrarian capitalism, contribute to the successful industrialization of Catalonia? Moreover, was the situation in Catalonia before industrialization comparable to the case of the Netherlands? See the introduction, page 37, which Wood views as involving the development of market dependence in the absence of capitalism. End of footnote. This view of some of the fundamental points of criticism should show why the theory of proto-industrialization is strained to breaking point. The growth of the literature on proto-industrialization over the last 40 years has generated a new wealth of often interdisciplinary research into phenomena that clearly need to be addressed within the larger context of the transition to industrialization. For John Davis, quote, the important common feature is the emphasis these studies place on the ways in which economic growth has been influenced by social, institutional, and other non-economic factors, end quote. He suggests that it may make, quote, better sense to think of, quote, proto-industry, end quote, as a frame of reference rather than a theory, end quote. Likewise, Jean Quatert, following Medic, argues that proto-industrialization theory, quote, should not be seen as an effort to conceptualize the whole transition from feudalism to industrial capitalism in one new overarching category. Its contribution is more modest, and the need is to formulate generalizations from local and regional studies instead of conducting empirical research on the basis of preconceived theories, end quote. Quatert, citing Medic. Ogilvy calls for a deeper investigation of various frameworks of social institutions and those social institutions' effects to explain the profound differences and divergences among European societies, all having in common the development of rural manufacturing in the early modern period. And Houston and Snell call for a, quote, less schematic and limiting approach which takes more account of the diversity of European social and economic development in the passage to industrialization. These suggestions may point us in the right direction, but is the game worth the candle? It is the use of the prefix, quote, proto, end quote, which binds the various writings together around the theoretical assumption, whether implicit or explicit, that the development of cottage manufacturing and putting out systems is a logical and necessary step in the direction of full industrialization. We submit that this assumption is a fallacy. All right, guys. Conclusion. In seeking to explain the origins of the Industrial Revolution, it is to be expected that theorists would attempt to trace a direct line of development, endogenous to the manufacturing sector from the era of the guilds to modern capitalist industry. But since the guilds were organized on a basis so completely antithetical to capitalist industry, it becomes necessary to identify a, quote, an intermediary, quote, stage, end quote, or, quote, phase, end quote, linking the one to the other. Thus, Neff points to the growth of large-scale, mostly state-run manufacturing enterprises in the 16th century, while proto-industrialization theory looks to the growth of cottage manufacturing for explanations. As we have seen, both theories are fraught with logical contradictions. Both theories suffer from the methodological flaw of attempting to read too many elements of Britain's Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries back into the 16th and 17th centuries. Both theories share this tendency towards anachronism as well as a high degree of economism with political economy in general. The way out of this trap is to reintroduce social and political factors into the analysis and also to situate early modern manufacturing in the proper context of being a, quote, sector, end quote, within an economy still very much dwarfed by agrarian production. In early modern England, the centralization of state power facilitated the class solidarity of an emerging landed oligarchy, asserting its power through Parliament. The expansion of economic leaseholds on land, treated as exclusive private property, recognized under common law as an expression of this ever-rising class power of the oligarchy. The transformation of social property relations associated with agrarian capitalism involved the growing market dependence of both the direct producers and the appropriators of surplus, who were increasingly operating under the compulsion of market imperatives. The dispossession of customary tenants, of those customary tenants' access to land, and the growing market dependence of the population fostered the rise of cottage manufacturing and the growth of the national market involving regional specialization to meet rising levels of market demand. Improved yields and falling grain prices further promoted the development of the domestic market, including an expansion of both urban and rural manufactures, and facilitated the internal stratification as well as the early decline of guilds in England relative to Europe. Craft masters and merchants employers explained their operations by concentrating production and putting out work to domestic workers in the countryside. In the face of an emerging price competition, the guild logic of monopoly control of markets to maintain quality and price at a high level was put under increasing strain. Responding to the apparent crisis within the crafts, the Tudor state under Elizabeth sought to regulate the crafts by elevating the customary practices set out in company bylaws, the apprenticeship rule in particular, to the level of national policy. This would have the peculiar effect of giving such forms of customary control over the labor process the backing of state industry that would ultimately provide domestic workers with a powerful bulwark against the imposition of capitalism. This in part helps to explain how it was possible for capitalism to advance sooner in agriculture than in manufactures, even without the state's effective sanction of customary labor practices in the crafts. It is likely that the resistance to capitalism would anyhow have been fiercer in manufactures than in agriculture. The process at the heart of agrarian capitalism was the conversion of land to capital, which implies not just the commodification of land, but its transformation to a specific form of property, whereby the owners and direct producers working the land are operating under conditions of market dependence and according to market imperatives. As we have seen in the case of mining, where land served centrally as the primary of production, just as it did in agriculture, the land was subject to a form of enclosure whereby the owner gained strict property rights under common law and local customary claims on the land were extinguished. It is one thing to divorce direct producers from the means of production, rendering the direct producers market dependent in the formal sense. It is quite another thing to render workers completely market dependent by extinguishing the customary regulations that provide workers protection from full exposure to the market. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution was the conversion of labor to capital, which implies not only the commodification of labor, but the subsumption of all manufacturing to the same logic governing agrarian capitalism, whereby under conditions of market dependence for both employers and workers, and in response to price competition in the marketplace, economic survival for employers comes to depend upon making improvements in the efficiency of production, including, of course, the efficiency of labor, ultimately through taking direct control of the labor process. Employers are therefore compelled to abandon the age-old and customary conceptions of labor in favor of conceptualizing the capacity of workers to labor. Their, quote, labor power, end quote, as abstract labor, as but one additional cost factor in the production process. However, unlike land, labor power is inseparable from the human beings whose capacity to labor is being, quote, owned, end quote, as a form of capital during the labor process. Human beings who also have the capacity to resist their subsumption to capital. In the centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, however, the subsumption of manufacturing or craft labor to capital was more formal than real, and was achieved mainly through capital assuming control over marketing arrangements and the means of production. The exceptional rise of cottage manufacturing in Britain is in large part a story of the conversion of peasants into part-time agricultural laborers and part-time domestic laborers. As enclosures encroached upon open field tenancies, domestic by-employment offered a means of compensation for the loss of access to the means of subsistence, as well as a substitute for production strategies designed to protect peasant families from the vagaries of market fluctuation. But urban domestic workers and full-time rural artisans themselves had no such alternatives. Here is another reason why it is not surprising that their resistance was more concerted and fiercer than the resistance that peasants and agrarian laborers put up against enclosures. By the 17th century, English society was subject to previously unknown strains and contractions. England's unique developments, the expansion of agrarian capitalist tenant farming on enclosed estates, the growth of regional specialization within a domestic market, and the centralization of the state, would all come to bear upon the outcome of a showdown between the patrimonial powers of the crown and the growing wealth and power of the landed classes, the outcome of which would stun elite society in Europe. The growing contradictions and disparities within the manufacturing and mercantile communities would shape the way in which merchants and craftsmen came to play key roles in this conflict, including the emergence of radical voices from the ranks of artisans calling for democracy and even a leveling of classes, or what would later be understood as socialism. End of chapter 1.